In the twilight realm where history dissolves into legend, there exists a kingdom that never was and always will be. Camelot rises from the mists of collective memory, a place constructed not from stone and mortar alone, but from the deepest yearnings of the human heart. It stands as humanity's most enduring vision of what a perfect society might become, where justice flows as freely as the rivers, where valor serves wisdom, and where the strong protect rather than dominate the weak. This kingdom, whether it occupied actual ground in the hills of Britain or existed only in the realm of possibility, has shaped the imagination of countless generations who have gazed upon their own flawed worlds and wondered what might be achieved if nobility of spirit could be woven into the very fabric of governance. The story begins not with triumph, but with treachery, not in daylight, but in darkness. Britain, in the years following Rome's withdrawal, had fractured into warring territories, each petty king clutching his portion of land, while Saxon invaders pressed ever deeper into the island's heart. Uther Pendragon had risen above this chaos through force of arms and strength of will, claiming the title of High King and bringing a semblance of unity to the feuding lords. Yet even a king who commands armies cannot always command his own desires, and it was desire that would set in motion the events leading to Camelot's founding. Uther looked upon Igraine, the beautiful wife of the Duke of Cornwall, and was consumed by a passion that acknowledged no boundaries of loyalty or honor. The Duke, perceiving the king's intentions and fearing for his wife's safety and his own position, withdrew with Igraine to the fortress of Tintagel, a castle that clung to Cornwall's rocky coast like an eagle's nest to a cliff face. The sea crashed against its foundations with furious persistence, and the single narrow causeway connecting the fortress to the mainland could be defended by a handful of men against an army. Here the Duke believed his wife would remain beyond Uther's reach, protected by stone walls and the temperamental ocean. But Uther's obsession had grown beyond reason, and in his desperation he turned to powers that existed in the margins between the old ways and the new, between the pagan wisdom that still lingered in Britain's forests and the Christian faith slowly spreading across the land. Merlin emerged from those margins, a figure whose very existence defied simple categorization. Some whispered he was the son of a demon and a mortal woman, inheriting supernatural powers from his father, while his mother's humanity granted him choice in how those powers would be used. Others claimed he was the last of the Druids, keeper of knowledge that predated Rome's eagles and would survive long after Rome's memory faded. What remained certain was that Merlin possessed sight that penetrated beyond the present moment, perceiving the patterns that shape history as a weaver perceives the threads that will form the tapestry. When Uther came to him with his mad desire, Merlin saw an opportunity to serve a purpose far greater than one king's lust. The bargain struck between them would echo through generations. Merlin would use his arts to transform Uther's appearance, making him identical to the Duke of Cornwall, allowing the king to pass Tintagel's defences and claim a single night with Igraine. In exchange, Uther would surrender to Merlin the child conceived during that night of deception. The king, thinking only of possessing the woman who had inflamed his thoughts, agreed without contemplating what such a promise might mean. That very night, while Uther wore the Duke's face and walked through doors that should have remained forever closed to him, the actual Duke of Cornwall fell in battle against Uther's forces, dying even as his wife unknowingly lay with the man who had orchestrated his doom. The child conceived in that moment of supernatural deception and mortal tragedy would carry within him the contradictions of his origins, born from both the highest and lowest aspects of human nature. Merlin claimed the infant as promised, spiriting him away before Igraine could form the bonds that would make surrender impossible. The child was given the name Arthur, and Merlin placed him in the care of Sir Ector, a loyal knight of no particular prominence whose modest estate existed far from the intrigues of royal courts. There Arthur grew alongside Ector's own son Kay, knowing nothing of the circumstances that had brought him to this place, believing himself to be merely another young man of minor noble birth. He learned to ride and to wield a sword, to read the weather and manage an estate, to value honesty and honour debts. His childhood unfolded in the wholesome obscurity of rural Britain, unmarked by any sign of the destiny that Merlin had perceived waiting within him like a seed waiting for spring. The years following Uther's death descended into chaos more profound than what had come before. Without a clear heir to unite the fractured nobility, Britain threatened to dissolve entirely into feuding territories. The Saxon advance continued unchecked as British lords spent their strength fighting one another for advantage. Merlin watched this dissolution and knew the moment had come to reveal the king he had been preparing. In the churchyard of London's greatest cathedral, a marvel appeared as if conjured from the earth itself. An anvil sat upon a massive stone, and thrust through both metal and rock was a magnificent sword, its blade catching light even in shadow. Letters worked into the stone proclaimed a simple challenge to all who read them. Whoever could draw the sword from the stone was the rightful king of all Britain. Lords and knights came from every corner of the fractured realm to test their strength against the sword's grip. They came with confidence born of noble birth, certain that their lineage or their might would prove sufficient to claim the weapon and the crown it represented. Each seized the handle with hands hardened by years of warfare, planting their feet and pulling with all the force they could summon. The sword remained as immovable as the stone that held it, mocking their efforts with its stillness. Some attempted dozens of times, returning again and again as if repetition might somehow overcome whatever force kept the blade locked in place. Others organized elaborate systems of levers and pulleys, applying mechanical advantage to a challenge that would not yield to mechanical solutions. The sword waited with the patience of ancient things, unmoved by ambition or frustration. Arthur came to London not as a contender, but as a squire attending his foster brother Kay, who had recently been knighted and saw in the sword an opportunity to claim power far beyond what his birth warranted. On the morning of a great tournament where knights would demonstrate their prowess before attempting the sword once more, Kay discovered he had forgotten his weapon at their lodgings. He sent Arthur racing back through London's waking streets to retrieve it, but in the confusion of tournament preparations, Arthur found their rooms locked with no key available. Time pressed urgently as Kay's turn in the lists approached, and Arthur found himself running past the churchyard where the sword stood unattended, all attention focused on the tournament grounds. In his mind existed only the simple problem before him. His brother needed a sword, and here stood one with no apparent owner present. Arthur grasped the handle without ceremony or witnesses, pulled without expectation of anything beyond solving the immediate practical problem, and the sword slid free as easily as if it had been resting in loose sand rather than stone and metal. He noticed nothing remarkable in this, assuming the weapon had been placed loosely in its setting for display purposes. Hurrying to the tournament grounds, he presented the blade to Kay, who recognized it immediately and understood what Arthur's success meant, even if Arthur himself did not. Kay briefly considered claiming he had drawn it himself, but his father Ector saw the sword, and the truth became inescapable. They brought Arthur back to the churchyard, where Merlin waited, having known with absolute certainty this moment would arrive. Under the witness of hundreds who had failed before him, Arthur returned the sword to its stone setting and drew it free again. The gathered nobles watched with expressions ranging from wonder to fury as this unknown youth of apparently minor birth accomplished what all their strength and status could not. 3 times Arthur sheathed and drew the sword, while protests echoed around him. Some shouted that it was trickery, that Merlin had used sorcery to make the task easy for his chosen puppet. Others demanded their own renewed attempts, certain that something had changed in the sword's enchantment. But when they tried again, the weapon remained as fixed as ever, yielding only to Arthur's hand. Merlin then revealed what he had kept hidden for 15 years, proclaiming Arthur's true parentage as the son of Uther Pendragon and rightful heir to Britain's throne. The revelation satisfied some and inflamed others. A portion of the nobility accepted the combination of miraculous sign and legitimate blood claim, bending their knees to acknowledge their new king. Others rejected Arthur entirely, seeing in him an upstart elevated by a wizard's manipulation, a youth whose only qualification was the ability to perform one impressive trick with an enchanted sword. Britain remained divided, and Arthur's first years as king were spent not in building his perfect kingdom, but in fighting to establish his right to rule at all. He led armies against rebel lords, demonstrated his courage in personal combat, showed mercy to defeated enemies when mercy could transform opponents into allies, and slowly, through determination and the wisdom Merlin provided, brought the warring factions into uneasy unity. Through these struggles, Arthur's character revealed itself not in grand pronouncements, but in small choices that accumulated into a visible pattern. When he defeated an enemy knight in battle, he offered respect rather than humiliation. When he captured a rebel lord's castle, he invited the lord's family to join his court rather than holding them hostage or casting them into poverty. When faced with decisions that pitted pragmatic advantage against honorable conduct, he chose honor even when it complicated his strategic position. Those who fought beside him began to see not just a legitimate claimant to the throne, but a man worth following for his own qualities, someone who might actually transform Britain into something better than the endless cycle of warfare and betrayal that had defined the post-Roman years. The vision began to crystallize in Arthur's mind during these formative struggles. He saw how Britain's chaos stemmed not just from Saxon invasion or the absence of Roman order, but from a fundamental failure of principle among the ruling class. Might had become the only arbiter of disputes, and those with the strength to take what they wanted did so without restraint or accountability. Justice existed only for those powerful enough to enforce it for themselves. The weak could hope at best for the mercy of the strong, and mercy was a rare commodity in kingdoms built on force. Arthur conceived of something different, a society where law would stand above personal power, where even the mightiest would be bound by the same codes that governed the humblest farmer, where strength would be channeled toward protection and service rather than domination and acquisition. When Arthur finally secured his position sufficiently to establish a permanent seat of power, he chose a location in the southwest, a place where hills rolled green under changeable skies and rivers ran clear through ancient valleys. Here he built his castle and his capital, naming it Camelot. The name itself seemed to capture something essential about his vision, musical and memorable, suggesting nobility and aspiration. The castle rose on its hill with towers that caught the first morning light and walls that stood strong without looming oppressive and dark. Within those walls, Arthur established his court according to principles that seemed revolutionary in their idealism. This would not be a place where the king's word was law simply because it was the king's word, but rather a fellowship of the best men the realm could offer, bound together by shared commitment to ideals larger than themselves. The symbol that would define this fellowship came to Arthur in a moment of inspiration that seemed almost divinely provided. At a great gathering meant to formally establish his court and bind the loyal lords more firmly to his cause, Arthur presented a massive round table crafted from oak that legends claimed had grown for centuries before being felled for this purpose. The table had no head and no foot, no position of primacy, and no seat of subordination. Every man who sat at this table would be equal to every other in the eyes of the fellowship, their status derived not from birth or wealth, but from their character and their willingness to serve the principles the round table represented. A king would sit among knights, and no physical arrangement would mark him as superior to his companions. The revolutionary nature of this gesture was not lost on those who witnessed it, for it represented a rejection of the hierarchical structures that had governed human society since humanity first organized itself into kingdoms. Arthur made the invitation clear. Any knight who would swear to uphold justice, protect the weak, show mercy to the defeated, speak truth, honor women, and place service above personal gain could seek a place at the round table. The seats would not be inherited or purchased, but earned through demonstrated character and maintained through continued adherence to the code. For the first time in Britain's history, nobility would mean something more than the accident of birth or the capacity for violence. It would mean a commitment to a set of ideals, a willingness to hold oneself to a higher standard, an acceptance that power brought responsibility rather than simply privilege. The men who would gather around this table would become the Knights of Camelot, and their stories would inspire generations yet unborn to believe that the world could be better than it was, that human society could aspire to something beyond mere survival and power accumulation. As news of the Round Table spread throughout Britain and beyond, something shifted in the collective consciousness of the realm. Young men of ambition began to see a path to glory that did not require them to become lords of war, taking and holding territory through force. They could instead become champions of justice, their names remembered not for the lands they conquered, but for the ideals they embodied. Camelot became a destination for those who had felt constrained by the brutal pragmatism of the age, who had harbored secret beliefs that virtue should matter more than strength. The best of Britain began to make their way to Arthur's court, drawn by the promise of something unprecedented, a kingdom that might actually deserve the loyalty it requested. In the great hall where the Round Table stood, a new world was taking shape, built on hope and determination, and the radical notion that human nature could be elevated rather than simply restrained. The perfect kingdom was beginning its rise, and for a brief span of years it would shine like a beacon against the darkness that surrounded it on every side. The first knights who answered Arthur's call came from backgrounds as varied as Britain itself, each bringing unique gifts and perspectives to the fellowship forming around the Round Table. They arrived not as a unified force, but as individuals who had heard whispers of something extraordinary taking shape in Camelot, men who sensed that Arthur's vision might offer purpose beyond the endless cycle of feudal obligation and territorial dispute. Some came from noble houses with ancient lineage, sons of lords who had fought for or against Uther Pendragon in the old wars. Others emerged from more modest circumstances, knights who had earned their spurs through valor in battle rather than inheriting them with estates and titles. What united them was not their origin but their recognition that the Round Table represented an opportunity to participate in something genuinely new, a chance to define themselves through their choices and actions rather than simply accepting the roles their births had assigned them. Among the earliest to pledge himself to Arthur's fellowship was Sir Kay, who had grown up beside the king and whose initial claim to the sword in the stone had been brief and false. Kay understood his own limitations with unusual clarity, knowing he possessed neither the supernatural virtue that allowed Arthur to draw the blade from stone, nor the tactical brilliance that marked truly great commanders. What he offered instead was unwavering loyalty and an organizational mind that excelled at transforming Arthur's grand visions into practical realities. While other knights dreamed of quests and single combat, Kay managed the complex logistics that allowed Camelot to function as both court and administrative centre. He ensured that supplies reached distant garrisons, that disputes between neighbouring lords were recorded and adjudicated fairly, that the kingdom's limited resources were allocated according to need rather than the influence of those making requests. His contribution lacked the glamour of battlefield heroics, but without his steady competence, Arthur's idealistic kingdom would have collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. Sir Bedivere arrived at Camelot carrying the reputation of a warrior who had never been defeated in personal combat, a distinction that had made him both celebrated and isolated in the harsh world of post-Roman Britain. Men feared to fight beside him because his prowess made their own skills appear inadequate by comparison, and they feared to fight against him because defeat seemed inevitable. In Arthur, he found not a king intimidated by his abilities, but rather someone who saw how such gifts might be directed toward purposes more meaningful than simply establishing dominance over other fighting men. Bedivere became Arthur's closest military advisor, the knight the king trusted to lead forces when Arthur himself could not be present. But more than his strategic mind or his skill with weapons, Bedivere brought an absolute commitment to Arthur's vision of a realm governed by justice rather than force. He understood viscerally that the ability to harm others created an obligation to protect them instead, and this understanding made him the embodiment of what the Round Table Knights were meant to become. From the wild borderlands where British territory gave way to unconquered Celtic kingdoms came Sir Gawain, nephew to Arthur, through the king's sister. Gawain possessed a curious quality that some attributed to the old blood running through his family's veins, others to blessing or curse from powers that predated Christian saints. His strength waxed and waned, with the sun's position in the sky growing to superhuman levels at midday before declining again as evening approached. This strange gift made him formidable, but also taught him lessons about the nature of power itself. He learned that might was temporary, that strength came and went according to rhythms beyond personal control, and that wisdom lay in recognizing the appropriate moments for action versus restraint. Gawain brought to the Round Table a connection to Britain's older traditions, a bridge between Arthur's vision of a civilized kingdom and the wild magic that still stirred in the island's ancient places. His presence suggested that Camelot's idealism need not mean rejecting everything that had come before, that new principles could be built upon old foundations. The establishment of the Round Table's code required Arthur and his closest advisors to articulate principles that had previously existed only as instincts and aspirations. They gathered in long sessions that stretched late into Camelot's nights, debating what exactly they meant when they spoke of justice, honour, and service. The discussions revealed how difficult it was to transform noble sentiments into practical guidelines that could govern actual behaviour in the complicated situations knights would inevitably face. What did justice mean when two parties both had legitimate grievances? How should a knight balance mercy against the need to protect others from dangerous individuals? When did loyalty to the fellowship supersede loyalty to one's own family or region? These were not abstract philosophical puzzles, but urgent practical questions that would determine whether the Round Table remained a beautiful idea or became a functional reality. The code that emerged from these debates was more nuanced than simple commands to be brave or virtuous. It acknowledged that knights would face situations where competing goods made clear right action difficult to discern. The code emphasized the primacy of protecting those unable to protect themselves, making special note that a knight's strength obligated him to serve as shield for the vulnerable rather than using that strength for personal advancement. It demanded truthfulness not just in formal oaths but in daily interactions, recognizing that trust formed the foundation of any fellowship, and that trust required consistency between words and actions. The code instructed knights to show courtesy to all they encountered regardless of social station, treating peasants and lords with equal respect, because a person's inherent worth was not determined by their position in the social hierarchy. Most radically, the code established that the Round Table itself, acting in concert, stood as the highest authority, that even Arthur must submit to the judgment of the fellowship if his actions violated the principles they had all sworn to uphold. This last provision revealed how seriously Arthur took his vision of a realm governed by law rather than the arbitrary will of those in power. He voluntarily constrained his own authority, acknowledging that absolute power inevitably corrupted those who wielded it, that even well-intentioned rulers needed accountability to prevent their inevitable mistakes from becoming catastrophes. The knights who heard this provision understood they were being invited into something unprecedented, a power structure that distributed authority rather than concentrating it, that created space for dissent and correction rather than demanding unquestioning obedience. Some found this exhilarating, a validation of their secret belief that humanity could govern itself more wisely than it had previously managed. Others found it unsettling, worried that a kingdom required clearer hierarchy to function effectively, that Arthur's willingness to submit to collective judgment might be perceived as weakness by enemies who would exploit any opening. As word of the Round Table's founding principles spread beyond Camelot's walls, the nature of requests reaching Arthur's court began to shift. Where previously people had come seeking the king's favor in disputes with neighbors or requesting military support against rivals, now they came with grievances about justice denied, with tales of the strong preying upon the weak, with pleas for intervention in situations where local lords had become petty tyrants within their own territories. These requests presented both opportunity and challenge. They offered chances for the Round Table knights to demonstrate that Camelot's ideals were not mere words but principles that would be actively enforced throughout the realm. But they also risked overextending the fellowship's limited numbers, and they required knights to insert themselves into local situations where the facts were often murky and the solutions far from obvious. The pattern that developed saw individual knights or small groups departing Camelot to address specific situations, then returning to report their actions to the full fellowship around the Round Table. These reports became teaching opportunities, chances for the knights to learn from one another's experiences and refine their understanding of how the code should be applied in practice. A knight might describe a situation where he had defeated a lord who was oppressing his people, only to have other knights question whether his intervention had actually improved things or simply replaced one power holder with another. Another might recount showing mercy to a defeated opponent, and the fellowship would debate whether mercy in that particular case had been wisdom or dangerous naivety. Through hundreds of such discussions, the Round Table knights developed a shared culture and a common understanding that made them increasingly effective as instruments of Arthur's vision. The early years of Camelot's existence saw the kingdom's reputation growing with remarkable speed. Stories spread through Britain and beyond about a court where justice could actually be found, where the weak were defended rather than exploited, where knights fought not for personal glory or material gain, but in service to principles larger than themselves. Young men throughout the realm began to dream of earning a place at the Round Table, seeing in those distant knights an ideal of manhood that differed dramatically from the brutal warrior culture that had previously dominated. Parents began teaching their children about Arthur's court, holding up the Round Table knights as examples of what people could become if they committed themselves to virtue. The stories took on lives of their own, growing and changing as they passed from teller to teller, until Camelot existed simultaneously as an actual place where real men worked to implement Arthur's vision, and as a mythic location that represented humanity's highest aspirations. Within Camelot itself, Arthur worked to ensure that the kingdom's governance reflected the principles being articulated by the Round Table. He established systems for hearing grievances that were open to people of all social classes, creating a framework where a peasant with a legitimate complaint could receive the same consideration as a landed noble. He directed resources toward building infrastructure that served common welfare rather than simply strengthening military defenses or enhancing royal comfort. Roads were improved to facilitate trade and communication. Bridges were constructed over rivers that had previously required dangerous fords. Markets were regulated to prevent merchants from exploiting those who had no alternative sources for essential goods. These practical improvements made Arthur's idealism tangible in ways that grand speeches and noble sentiments never could, demonstrating that the Round Table's code was meant to transform actual living conditions rather than existing merely as lofty rhetoric. The Golden Age that historians would later identify in Camelot's story was not a period of perfect harmony where all problems vanished and every person found contentment. It was rather a time when the gap between the real and the ideal seemed bridgeable, when people could reasonably believe that sustained effort might actually create a society fundamentally better than what had come before. Disputes still arose between neighbors and within families. Crimes were still committed by those who valued personal gain over communal welfare. Natural disasters brought suffering that no amount of good governance could prevent. But the response to these inevitable challenges differed from what had been normal in Britain's recent past. People increasingly expected that wrongs would be addressed rather than simply endured, that those with power would be held accountable for how they exercised it, that solutions would be sought through deliberation and law rather than through violence and the imposition of the strong's will upon the weak. The Round Table itself grew as new knights earned places among the fellowship, each addition carefully considered and debated. The process for joining was neither simple nor automatic. A candidate might demonstrate exceptional valor in battle, yet be rejected because his motivations were judged insufficiently pure. Another might come from undistinguished background and lack the martial prowess of more famous warriors, yet be welcomed because his character embodied the qualities the fellowship sought to cultivate. This selectivity gave membership its meaning, ensured that sitting at the Round Table represented genuine achievement rather than hereditary privilege or the reward for military service. The number of seats was limited by the table's physical size, which created both practical constraint and symbolic significance. Every knight knew his place existed because others had judged him worthy, and that knowledge encouraged continued effort to deserve the honor that had been granted. Among the fellowship, bonds formed that transcended the normal relationships between warriors who fought beside one another. The knights became genuinely committed to one another's welfare and development, offering correction when they saw brothers straying from the code's requirements, providing support when difficulties arose, celebrating one another's triumphs with sincere joy rather than competitive envy. They developed the ability to disagree without hostility, to argue passionately about the right course of action while maintaining respect for those who held different views. This capacity for productive conflict made the Round Table far more than a collection of individual heroes. It became a functioning fellowship capable of collective wisdom that exceeded what any single member, even Arthur, could achieve alone. Merlin observed these developments with satisfaction mixed with foreboding. He had worked for decades to bring Arthur to the throne and establish the conditions where Camelot might flourish, and the success exceeded his most optimistic projections. The kingdom Arthur had built was actually accomplishing what Merlin had glimpsed in his visions, transforming abstract ideals into concrete reality. Yet Merlin's sight extended beyond the present golden age into futures that approached with inexorable certainty. He perceived the shadows gathering at the edges of Camelot's brightness, saw the seeds of tragedy already planted in soil that currently yielded such abundant harvest. The very qualities that made the Round Table knights noble also made them vulnerable to particular forms of failure. Their intense commitment to the code created rigidity when flexibility might serve better. Their elevated ideals made it difficult for them to forgive human weakness in themselves or others. Their bonds of loyalty would become chains that prevented wise action when loyalty conflicted with justice. The wizard kept these perceptions largely to himself, understanding that knowing the future in detail could paralyze action in the present. He offered guidance when asked, dropped hints when he believed they might be heeded, but did not burden Arthur or the knights with full knowledge of what awaited them. What purpose would be served by telling men in the midst of building something magnificent that their creation was doomed to fall? Would they work less diligently or guard more carefully against the specific failures Merlin foresaw? Or would the knowledge itself become a poison, introducing suspicion and fear that would accelerate the very destruction he hoped they might avoid or delay? Merlin chose silence on these ultimate matters, playing his role as counselor and occasionally cryptic guide, while allowing events to unfold according to patterns his sight suggested, but could not absolutely confirm. The years of Camelot's golden age accumulated like treasures in a vault, each season adding memories of tournaments where knights demonstrated their skills in friendly competition, of festivals where people throughout the realm celebrated their connection to something larger than their own immediate concerns, of quests successfully completed and wrongs righteously corrected. Arthur aged from the uncertain young king who had drawn a sword from stone into a mature ruler whose wisdom and judgment had been tested and proven through countless decisions. The Round Table knights became famous throughout Britain and beyond, their names spoken with reverence and their deeds recounted as inspirations. Parents named children after favorite knights, and those children grew up on stories of Camelot's marvels. The kingdom stood as proof that human society could aspire to nobility, that the cynical acceptance of corruption and brutality as inevitable features of civilization was not the only possible stance. For a span of years that seemed eternal while they lasted, but would prove heartbreakingly brief. The perfect kingdom existed not just as dream but as actual place, and those fortunate enough to witness its flowering believed they were seeing the future of human possibility taking shape before their eyes. The Holy Grail entered Camelot's story not through military conquest or political maneuvering, but through vision and mystery, arriving in consciousness before it appeared in form. Rumours had circulated for years about a sacred relic hidden somewhere in Britain, or perhaps beyond its shores, an object connected to the deepest mysteries of the Christian faith that had been spreading across the island since Roman times. Some identified it as the cup from which Christ had drunk at the Last Supper, the vessel that had caught his blood when the Roman lance pierced his side on the cross. Others described it as a platter or stone imbued with supernatural properties, capable of providing sustenance or healing or revealing truth to those pure enough to approach it. The stories varied in their specifics but agreed on essential points. The Grail existed somewhere in the world. It held power that transcended ordinary understanding, and finding it required more than geographical knowledge or military prowess. It demanded spiritual qualities that even the best of Arthur's knights might not possess. The quest began on a Pentecost feast, when the Round Table Fellowship had gathered in full assembly, a rare occurrence since the knights were usually scattered across Britain and beyond on various missions. Arthur had made it tradition to refuse food until some marvel or adventure had presented itself, a custom that acknowledged how the Round Table had become a magnet for the extraordinary. On this particular feast, the marvel arrived with dramatic suddenness. The great hall's doors blew open though no wind stirred outside, and a radiance entered that seemed to emanate from no visible source. Those present would later struggle to describe what they witnessed, their accounts differing in detail, but united in conveying how the experience transcended normal perception. Some saw a golden chalice floating through the air, others a brilliant light that resolved into no specific form, still others a veiled object whose exact nature remained hidden, even as its presence overwhelmed the senses. In the aftermath of the vision's departure, the hall remained silent for a long moment as the assembled knights attempted to process what they had experienced. Then Sir Gawain rose from his place at the round table and made a pronouncement that would alter the fellowship's course irrevocably. He vowed to undertake a quest to find the Holy Grail, to pursue this sacred object until he either achieved the goal or died in the attempt. The declaration spread through the knights like fire through dry timber. One after another they stood and made similar vows, each committing himself to the same impossible quest. Within minutes, virtually every member of the Round Table had pledged to abandon all other pursuits and dedicate themselves entirely to finding the Grail. Arthur watched this unfold with emotions that tore him in opposite directions. Part of him swelled with pride at the spiritual ambition his knights demonstrated, their willingness to pursue the highest possible goal regardless of the personal cost. But a deeper wisdom born from years of governance recognized the danger in what was happening. The Round Table had been created to serve Britain's people, to be instruments of justice and protection throughout the realm. If all the knights departed simultaneously on individual spiritual quests, who would defend the borders against Saxon raiders? Who would mediate disputes between rival lords? Who would ensure that the systems Arthur had built continued to function in the absence of those who enforced them? The quest for the Grail, however noble in conception, threatened to hollow out Camelot's strength at precisely the moment when the kingdom needed its defenders most concentrated and available. Merlin shared Arthur's misgivings, but for different reasons rooted in his unique perspective. He perceived how the Grail quest represented a fundamental shift in the Round Table's purpose, a turn away from engaging with the world's practical challenges toward pursuing individual spiritual perfection. The fellowship had been built on the principle that noble individuals working together could improve society, that collective action guided by shared principles could address injustice and create better conditions for all. The Grail quest, by contrast, was intensely individual. Each knight would pursue his own path, measured not by his service to others, but by the purity of his own soul. Success would come to those who achieved personal holiness, while those who fell short in spiritual development would fail regardless of how effectively they had served the common good. Merlin understood that this shift, however understandable given the knight's exposure to the vision, would fracture the fellowship in ways that military defeat never could. Despite these reservations, neither Arthur nor Merlin could reasonably forbid the quest. The vision had been genuine, its impact on those who witnessed it undeniable. To command the knights to ignore what they had experienced would be to violate the spiritual autonomy that made them worthy of their positions. Arthur could only watch as the flower of British chivalry prepared to scatter across the known world and beyond, each knight following his own interpretation of how the Grail might be found. He extracted promises that they would return to Camelot if they survived, that the fellowship would reconvene regardless of whether the quest succeeded or failed. But even as the knights swore these oaths, Arthur perceived how the bright unity that had defined the Round Table's golden age was already beginning to fragment. The quests themselves unfolded in patterns as varied as the knights who undertook them. Sir Gawain approached the challenge with his characteristic boldness, riding into wild lands where ancient powers still held sway, confronting dangers both physical and supernatural with the strength that waxed with the sun's ascent. He battled creatures that belonged more to nightmare than waking world, endured tests that pushed his courage to its limits, pursued every rumor and hint that might lead toward the Grail's location. Yet, for all his valor and determination, Gawain found himself repeatedly turned back from the quest's completion. He would arrive at castles where the Grail was said to reside, only to discover the stories false or the object already moved. He would overcome tremendous obstacles to reach sacred sites, only to find himself unable to perceive what others claimed was plainly visible. Gawain slowly came to understand that the qualities that made him a great knight in worldly terms counted for little in this spiritual endeavor, that the Grail demanded virtues he had not sufficiently cultivated. Sir Percival took a different approach, one shaped by his particular background and temperament. He had come to the Round Table from relative obscurity, a young knight of pure intentions but limited sophistication. Where other knights brought years of training in courtesy and complex theology, Percival offered simple faith and an absence of the cynicism that often accompanied worldly experience. His quest took him through a series of encounters that tested his innocence while simultaneously protecting it. He stumbled into situations where more knowledgeable knights would have recognized spiritual significance, yet his very naivety sometimes allowed him to act correctly where calculation would have led astray. Percival came closer than most to achieving the quest, actually beholding the Grail on more than one occasion. But each time, some small failure of understanding or courage prevented him from asking the crucial question or taking the necessary action that would have allowed him to claim the prize and complete the quest. The knight who ultimately achieved what the others could not was Sir Galahad, whose very existence seemed designed by Providence to succeed where others failed. He had arrived at Camelot only shortly before the Grail vision, a young knight of extraordinary beauty and grace, whose origins were themselves shrouded in miraculous circumstance. Galahad was the son of Sir Lancelot, the greatest of Arthur's knights, but his mother had been a figure of mystery, and his conception the result of events that seemed orchestrated by powers beyond human control. From his first appearance, Galahad demonstrated qualities that set him apart even among the exceptional company of the Round Table. His purity was not merely the absence of sin, but a positive radiance of holiness that others could perceive in his presence. His strength in combat was formidable, yet he wielded it without pride or anger. His dedication to the quest was absolute, but rooted in love rather than ambition. Galahad's journey toward the Grail moved with a kind of inevitability that the other quests lacked. Obstacles that blocked other knights seemed to dissolve before him. Mysteries that confused others became clear in his presence. He travelled with two companions, Sir Percival and Sir Bors, creating a trinity of questers whose combined virtues approached what was required. Bors brought steadfast loyalty and the groundedness of a man who had experienced both worldly life and spiritual aspiration. Percival contributed his innocent faith and willingness to learn. Galahad provided the transcendent purity that the quest ultimately demanded. Together they navigated trials that tested every aspect of their characters, demonstrating courage without recklessness, wisdom without pride, faith without fanaticism. The path led them eventually to a mystical castle where the Grail was kept, tended by a wounded king whose suffering could only be ended by the right question asked by the right person. This fisher king had been injured years before in ways that defied natural healing, his wound reflecting spiritual damage to the land itself. The kingdom over which he nominally ruled had become a wasteland, fertile fields turned barren, healthy forests withered to dead wood, prosperity replaced by inexplicable decline. The fisher king waited in his castle for the pure knight, whose arrival and whose question would restore what had been lost. Many knights had reached this place over the years, but all had failed at the crucial moment, either asking the wrong question or remaining silent when they should have spoken. Galahad succeeded where others failed, not through superior cleverness, but through the natural expression of his compassionate nature. When he witnessed the Fisher King's suffering and understood its connection to the Grail's power, he asked the question that arose spontaneously from genuine concern for another's pain. "What ails you? How can you be healed?" The simplicity of the inquiry masked its profound significance. Galahad was not asking to satisfy curiosity or to solve a puzzle that would advance his quest. He was expressing authentic care for another being's suffering, placing the king's needs above his own spiritual ambitions. This quality of selfless love was what the Grail demanded, and in asking the question with pure intent, Galahad simultaneously achieved his quest and released the Fisher King from his long torment. The Grail revealed itself to Galahad in its full glory, no longer veiled or partially glimpsed, but present in all its supernatural radiance. What exactly he saw and experienced in that moment remained beyond his capacity to fully communicate afterward. He attempted to describe overwhelming love, perfect knowledge, union with the divine, but words failed to capture the reality of the encounter. What was clear was that Galahad had touched something beyond the material world, had experienced a perfection of existence that made ordinary life seem pale and diminished by comparison. The experience transformed him in fundamental ways, burning away the last remnants of mortal limitation. When Galahad finally departed the Fisher King's castle, he did not return to Camelot, but instead ascended directly into the eternal realm his soul had glimpsed. His physical body could no longer contain the spiritual reality he had become through the Grail's grace. Percival and Bors, who had witnessed these events without being able to fully participate in them, faced the choice of remaining in the mystical lands where the Grail resided or returning to the world they had left behind. Percival chose to stay, becoming a guardian of the Grail and the healed Fisher King's realm, his quest complete, even though he had not personally achieved Galahad's transcendent union. Bors alone returned to Camelot, bearing news of what had transpired and carrying the weight of experiences that could never be adequately translated into language his fellow knights would fully understand. His return marked the quest's official conclusion, though many knights remained scattered throughout the world, still pursuing the Grail despite evidence that the object had been found and its primary mystery resolved. The impact of the Grail quest on Camelot and the Round Table proved devastating in ways that were not immediately apparent. When the knights had first departed, their absence created practical problems that the kingdom struggled to address, but eventually managed through adaptation and the efforts of those few who had not joined the quest. But as years passed and knights failed to return, dying in distant lands or becoming lost in pursuit of an already achieved goal, the Fellowship's strength declined past any point of recovery. The Round Table that had once held the flower of British chivalry now sat half empty, its vacant seats testifying to the cost of spiritual ambition pursued without sufficient regard for worldly consequences. More subtle but equally significant was the change the quest wrought in those who did survive and return. They had experienced things that set them apart from those who remained behind, creating divisions within the Fellowship where previously there had been unity. Knights who had come close to the Grail but failed to achieve it often returned marked by a sense of inadequacy, measuring themselves against an impossible standard and finding themselves wanting. They had learned that excellence in conventional knightly virtues counted for little in spiritual terms, that their years of service and sacrifice did not make them pure enough to approach the sacred. This knowledge introduced a quality of weariness and disillusionment that poisoned the confidence and joy that had characterized Camelot's golden age. Arthur grieved for what the quest had cost his kingdom and his fellowship, though he could not bring himself to condemn the impulse that had driven the knights towards spiritual transcendence. He understood that humans required meaning beyond mere survival or even prosperity, that the soul demanded challenges worthy of its highest capacities. The Grail quest had offered that challenge, had called the knights toward the noblest possible goal. That so many had failed, that the quest had fractured the Round Table and left the kingdom weakened, reflected not the unworthiness of the goal, but rather the tragic reality that human nature rarely achieves the heights it is capable of reaching. The fellowship had been revealed as composed of men rather than saints, and this knowledge, however truthful, made it impossible to sustain the absolute idealism that had defined Camelot's founding vision. The perfect kingdom had discovered its limitations, and in that discovery lay the first real signs of eventual dissolution. Before the Grail quest had fractured the Round Table's unity, before the shadows lengthened over Camelot's golden age, there had been a moment of pure triumph when the greatest knight in Christendom arrived at Arthur's court, seeking a place among the fellowship. Sir Lancelot du Lac came from across the narrow sea that separated Britain from the continental lands, bearing a reputation that had spread through every kingdom where martial prowess was valued. Stories preceded him of tournaments where he had defeated entire fields of competitors without suffering a single defeat, of bandits and monsters vanquished, of impossible odds overcome through combinations of skill and courage that seemed to transcend human limitation. Yet the man who rode through Camelot's gates carried his fame lightly, demonstrating neither the arrogance that often accompanied such achievement nor false modesty that would have been its own form of pride. Arthur recognized immediately what Lancelot's presence could mean for the Round Table and for his vision of a kingdom governed by justice rather than raw power. Here was a warrior whose abilities might actually match the ideals the fellowship claimed to embody, someone who could serve as living proof that excellence in combat could be paired with nobility of character. The king welcomed Lancelot with genuine warmth, inviting him not merely to join the Round Table, but to become a central figure within the fellowship. In the conversations that followed during Lancelot's first days at Camelot, Arthur discovered that the knight's inner life matched the promise of his reputation. Lancelot spoke thoughtfully about the responsibilities that came with superior martial skill, about his belief that strength created obligation to protect rather than dominate, about his desire to serve purposes larger than personal glory or material reward. The bond that formed between Arthur and Lancelot developed with unusual speed and intensity, moving beyond the normal relationship between king and knight into something approaching brotherhood. They were different in essential ways, Arthur's strengths lying in governance and strategic vision, while Lancelot excelled in the immediate challenges of personal combat. But these differences complemented rather than conflicted. Arthur saw in Lancelot the embodiment of what his knights might become, the perfect synthesis of prowess and principle. Lancelot found in Arthur the worthiest cause to which he could dedicate his considerable gifts, a king whose vision justified the absolute loyalty that Lancelot was prepared to offer. They spent long hours together discussing philosophy and strategy, sharing the kind of thoughts that required trust to express, building a connection that both men valued as among the most significant relationships of their lives. Lancelot's integration into the Round Table fellowship proceeded with remarkable smoothness. The other knights, who might have felt threatened by someone of such superior abilities, instead found themselves inspired by his presence. Lancelot demonstrated his prowess without making others feel diminished, offering guidance to less skilled warriors in ways that enhanced, rather than undermined, their confidence. In tournaments, he fought with dazzling excellence, but showed such grace toward defeated opponents that losing to him became almost an honor rather than a humiliation. On quests he achieved objectives that had stymied others, yet his reports to the fellowship emphasized lessons learned and challenges faced, rather than simply cataloguing triumphs. He became not just the greatest of the Round Table knights, but also in many ways the most beloved. a figure who inspired others to elevate their own conduct through the example he set. The place where Lancelot's character showed a flaw, where the perfect knight revealed himself to be human and therefore fallible, was in his relationship with Queen Guinevere. She had come to Arthur as part of a political alliance, her marriage to the king serving to secure the loyalty of her father's territories and strengthen Arthur's position among the British nobility. The union had been founded on diplomatic necessity rather than romantic love, though Arthur and Guinevere had developed genuine affection and respect for one another over the years of their marriage. She admired her husband's vision and supported his efforts to transform Britain into something better than the brutal kingdoms that had preceded Camelot. He valued her intelligence and her ability to manage the complex social dynamics of the court. But the marriage lacked the kind of passionate intensity that stories and songs celebrated, settling instead into comfortable partnership that served the kingdom's needs while leaving certain emotional depths unplumbed. When Guinevere first encountered Lancelot, something ignited between them that neither had anticipated or initially understood. It began as simple recognition of excellence, the queen appreciating the knight's obvious qualities in the same way that everyone at Camelot had come to admire him. But beneath this surface appreciation ran currents that disturbed the careful composure both maintained. Guinevere found herself thinking about Lancelot at odd moments, noting his presence in any gathering, seeking opportunities for conversation that could be justified by her role as queen, but that satisfied hungers having nothing to do with courtly duty. Lancelot experienced parallel disturbance, catching himself watching the queen when she was unaware of his attention, comparing other women unfavorably to her grace and intelligence, feeling inexplicable joy when circumstances brought them into proximity. For a long time, neither acknowledged these feelings even to themselves, much less to each other. The barriers seemed absolute and impermeable. Guinevere was Arthur's wife, crowned queen of the realm, a woman whose honor was inseparable from Camelot's legitimacy. Lancelot was Arthur's greatest knight, bound by oaths of loyalty that made betraying the king unthinkable. The friendship between Arthur and Lancelot gave the situation additional weight, transforming what might have been merely a violation of feudal obligation into a personal betrayal of the man both Lancelot and Guinevere genuinely loved and admired. The very impossibility of the situation should have protected them, should have kept dangerous attraction from developing into something more substantial and threatening. But emotions follow their own logic, indifferent to rational calculation or moral imperatives. The more Lancelot and Guinevere tried to maintain appropriate distance, the more they found themselves drawn together. Court life provided countless opportunities for interaction that could not be avoided without drawing exactly the kind of attention they wished to prevent. Tournaments required the queen to present favors to knights, and when Guinevere presented hers to Lancelot, the touch of hands during the exchange carried charge that both felt and neither could name. Diplomatic receptions meant hours of formal conversation where Lancelot's duties as preeminent knight required him to attend the queen, and those dutiful conversations became the parts of such events that both anticipated with unseemly eagerness. Garden walks undertaken for fresh air and exercise somehow resulted in chance meetings that occurred too frequently to be truly accidental. The moment when unspoken attraction transformed into acknowledged love came not through dramatic declaration but through accumulated small revelations. A look held slightly too long, eyes meeting with understanding that transcended the words being exchanged. A conversation about apparently neutral topics that both parties recognized was actually about their feelings for each other, conducted in the kind of code that lovers develop to communicate dangerous truths. Hands touching during a dance at a feast, the contact electric and lasting a fraction longer than propriety allowed. These moments built upon one another until denial became impossible, until both Lancelot and Guinevere understood that what existed between them was genuine love rather than mere attraction, and that this love created a crisis neither knew how to resolve. The conflict tore at Lancelot with particular intensity because his entire identity was built upon being the perfect knight, the living embodiment of the Round Table's ideals. He had dedicated himself absolutely to Arthur's service, had sworn oaths that bound him to protect and honor his king above all earthly considerations. The code he had committed himself to uphold demanded loyalty, truth, and the subjugation of personal desire to duty. Yet here he stood, hopelessly in love with his king's wife, harboring thoughts and feelings that made a mockery of every principle he claimed to hold sacred. The contradiction poisoned his peace, made him question whether his celebrated virtue had ever been more than performance, whether beneath the surface of his noble actions had always lurked this capacity for profound betrayal. Guinevere wrestled with her own version of these torments. She had married Arthur willingly despite the political origins of their union, had committed herself to being a worthy queen for a kingdom that represented genuine hope for a better world. She understood that her behavior reflected on Arthur's honor, that any hint of impropriety would damage not just her husband personally, but the entire structure of legitimacy he had built. As queen, she was not merely a woman who had made certain vows, but a symbol of Camelot's virtue, living proof that the nobility the Round Table claimed to embody extended to the very heart of the kingdom. To betray Arthur with his greatest knight would not be simple adultery, but something closer to sacrilege, a violation that would strike at Camelot's foundations. Yet understanding the stakes did not diminish the feelings that had taken root. Love, once established, does not respond to rational arguments about why it should not exist. Lancelot and Guinevere found themselves trapped between equally powerful forces. Duty, honor, loyalty, gratitude, and genuine love for Arthur pulled them one direction. The deep connection they felt to each other, the sense that they had found in one another something precious and irreplaceable, pulled them the other way. They could neither consummate their love without destroying everything they valued, nor eliminate the love itself through acts of will. The situation created a kind of permanent crisis, a tension that could not be resolved but only endured, managed, denied, or eventually surrendered to. For a time, they maintained the appearance of propriety through exhausting constant vigilance. They avoided being alone together, ensured that any necessary interactions occurred in contexts where others were present, cultivated careful formality in their speech and manner toward each other. To outside observers, the Queen and the greatest knight maintained exactly the relationship that duty demanded, cordial and appropriate, with no hint of anything inappropriate. But those close to both began to notice subtle signs that suggested disturbance beneath the surface. Lancelot's famous confidence showed cracks, moments of distraction or melancholy that seemed out of character for someone of his assured nature. Guinevere's warmth toward Arthur became slightly forced at times, as though she were performing the role of devoted wife rather than simply being one. Arthur himself remained largely oblivious to these undercurrents, at least in the early stages of the developing crisis. His trust in both Lancelot and Guinevere was so complete that the possibility of betrayal simply did not occur to him. When others made veiled comments or expressed concerns, Arthur dismissed them as misinterpretations or jealous gossip. How could the man he considered his closest friend and truest supporter betray him? How could the wife who had stood beside him through all of Camelot's challenges suddenly prove faithless? The very strength of Arthur's relationships with both parties blinded him to the danger those relationships contained, made him unable to perceive what might have been obvious to someone less emotionally invested. The pattern that developed could not be sustained indefinitely. Human nature being what it is, perfect restraint forever, was an unrealistic expectation. The exact moment when Lancelot and Guinevere finally allowed their love to become physical would later be disputed, some placing it earlier and others later in Camelot's timeline. What mattered less than the specific timing was the fact that eventually, despite all their efforts at restraint, despite genuine horror at what they were doing to Arthur and to the kingdom, the lovers found moments of private union. These encounters brought intense joy mixed with crushing guilt, satisfaction of genuine emotional and physical need, combined with awareness that every meeting compounded the betrayal of the man they both honored. The affair remained secret for a surprisingly long time, protected by the lovers' caution and by the unwillingness of those who suspected to bring accusations without absolute proof. But secrets of such magnitude create ripples that observant people can detect. Knights who revered Lancelot noticed changes in his demeanor, moments when his thoughts seemed far from whatever immediate situation he occupied. Ladies of the court who attended Guinevere perceived shifts in the queen's emotional weather, days of radiant happiness alternating with periods of withdrawn melancholy. These observations, initially kept private or shared only in whispers among trusted confidants, gradually accumulated into a cloud of rumor and suspicion that hung over Camelot like smoke from distant fires. The situation had become one of those crises that develop slowly enough that people can convince themselves it might not be happening, that perhaps they are misinterpreting innocent circumstances, that bringing the issue into the open would cause more damage than allowing ambiguity to persist. But beneath the surface, fault lines were spreading through Camelot's foundations. The perfect kingdom had always depended on the virtue of those at its center, on the assumption that Arthur, Guinevere, and the greatest knights of the Round Table embodied the ideals they proclaimed. If that assumption proved false, if the king was a cuckold unable to control his own household, if the queen was an adulteress and the greatest knight a traitor who had violated his most sacred oaths, then what remained of Camelot's claim to represent humanity's highest potential? The love between Lancelot and Guinevere, however genuine and however understandable in human terms, carried the capacity to bring down everything Arthur had built. And the miracle was not that it would eventually cause catastrophe, but that the catastrophe had been delayed as long as it had. The affair between Lancelot and Guinevere deepened over months and years, evolving from desperate stolen moments into something that felt almost like a parallel marriage, existing in the shadows of the legitimate one. They developed the elaborate systems of communication that illicit lovers must create, subtle signals that conveyed meaning invisible to outsiders, but perfectly clear to those fluent in their private language. A particular flower placed in a vase indicated availability for meeting. A phrase dropped into public conversation specified location and time. The wearing of certain colors communicated emotional states or warned of danger. These codes required constant vigilance to maintain, adding layers of complexity and risk to interactions that should have been simple if they had been innocent. The lovers found refuge in a few carefully selected locations where privacy could be maintained without arousing suspicion. Gardens at twilight offered plausible reasons for presence, while providing shadows that concealed more than they revealed. The chapel, during hours when most of the court occupied themselves elsewhere, became another meeting place, the sacred setting adding bitter irony to their transgression. Most secure was a chamber in one of Camelot's older towers, a room that had been forgotten in the expansion of the castle, and that only Guinevere's longtime handmaiden knew they used. This handmaiden, bound to the queen by years of service and personal loyalty, became an unwitting accomplice to the affair, standing guard during meetings and providing cover stories when needed. In these stolen hours, Lancelot and Guinevere existed in a reality separate from their public lives. They were not queen and knight burdened with duty and surrounded by expectations, but simply two people who had found in each other a connection they had despaired of ever experiencing. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing thoughts too personal for public utterance, revealing vulnerabilities they showed to no one else. Lancelot described the loneliness of being constantly measured against impossible standards, the exhaustion of always needing to be perfect, because others had decided he represented the ideal of knighthood. Guinevere spoke of the isolation inherent in her position, how being queen meant existing as symbol rather than person, how everyone who approached her wanted something or saw only the crown rather than the woman who wore it. The physical intimacy they shared brought pleasure certainly, but its deeper significance lay in the communion it represented. In a world where both were constantly observed and judged, where neither could afford to show weakness or uncertainty, they had found someone with whom complete honesty was possible. The relief this provided was itself almost addictive, creating dependence that went beyond mere physical attraction. They needed each other not just as lovers but as refugees from the relentless demands their positions imposed. This made the affair simultaneously more understandable and more dangerous, because what they had built together was not a simple matter of lust that might burn itself out, but rather a genuine alternate life that fulfilled needs their legitimate relationships could not address. Yet every moment of connection carried the weight of betrayal. Arthur was not some distant figurehead or cruel tyrant whose wife might reasonably seek affection elsewhere. He was a good man and a good king who had given both Lancelot and Guinevere every reason to honor him with loyalty. He trusted them absolutely, treated them with respect and affection, built his kingdom and his personal life on the assumption that those closest to him would remain true. Every time the lovers met, they compounded their violation of that trust, added another layer to a deception that grew more elaborate and burdensome with each passing month. The guilt they both felt was genuine and corrosive, poisoning even their happiest moments together with awareness of what their happiness cost the man they were betraying. Lancelot suffered particularly acute torment from this contradiction. His identity had been built entirely around being the perfect embodiment of knightly virtue, someone who could be held up as the standard against which all others were measured. The Round Table's code demanded absolute loyalty to one's lord, absolute honoring of oaths sworn, absolute protection of the innocent rather than exploitation of the vulnerable. On every count, Lancelot's affair with Guinevere represented the most profound possible violation of his stated principles. He was betraying the king he had sworn to serve unto death, breaking vows that he had proclaimed sacred, taking advantage of private access to seduce a woman who should have been as far beyond his reach as the stars. The hypocrisy was staggering, and Lancelot was too intelligent and too honest with himself to avoid recognizing it. This self-knowledge drove him into periods of black despair, where he questioned whether he had ever possessed genuine virtue or had merely been play-acting nobility while waiting for his true nature to reveal itself. During these dark times, Lancelot would withdraw from Guinevere, sometimes for weeks, determined to end the affair and reclaim the integrity that had defined him. He would throw himself into quests with desperate energy, seeking situations dangerous enough to demand his complete attention, hoping that distance and distraction might break the hold Guinevere had on his heart. He achieved remarkable things during these periods of attempted reform, completing missions that added to his already legendary reputation. But inevitably he would return to Camelot, and the sight of Guinevere would undo all his resolutions, pulling him back into the pattern he knew was destroying him. Guinevere experienced her own cycles of resolution and surrender, though her torment took different forms. As queen, she bore responsibility not just for her own conduct, but for the stability of the entire kingdom. She understood better than Lancelot how much Camelot's legitimacy rested on the perception that Arthur's household embodied the ideals being promoted throughout the realm. A king whose wife betrayed him with his greatest knight became a figure of mockery rather than respect. His authority undermined not by military defeat or policy failure, but by his inability to maintain order in his own bedchamber. Guinevere knew that if the affair became public knowledge, the damage would extend far beyond personal embarrassment to threaten everything Arthur had built. This knowledge prompted her own attempts to end the relationship. She would tell Lancelot in tearful confrontations that they could not continue, that the risk was too great and the wrong too profound. She would avoid situations where they might be alone together, fill her days with activities that left no space for illicit meetings, treat Lancelot with formal distance when they encountered each other in public settings. For days or sometimes weeks, she would maintain this determined separation, convincing herself that she had finally found the strength to do what honor demanded. But the loneliness would return, the sense that the only person who truly understood her had been cut off, and she would find herself sending the signal that meant she was willing to meet again. Lancelot would respond with the desperate eagerness of an addict offered a substance he had been trying to quit, and the cycle would begin again. The other knights of the Round Table began to divide into factions as awareness of the affair spread despite the lovers' precautions. Some refused to believe the rumors, insisting that Lancelot's virtue was beyond question and that the whispers represented nothing more than jealous slander from those who resented his preeminence. These defenders would hear no criticism of their champion, responding to any suggestion of impropriety with heated denials and accusations that the accusers themselves harbored dishonorable motives. Their loyalty was admirable in its intensity, but dangerous in its blindness, creating a protected space around Lancelot that allowed the affair to continue by making investigations seem disloyal. Others, particularly those whose own conduct had been scrutinized by the rigorous moral standards Lancelot supposedly embodied, felt a kind of bitter satisfaction in the revelation of his hypocrisy. They had been judged and found wanting by a code that Lancelot himself was spectacularly violating, and the discovery of his failings seemed to validate their own lesser transgressions. These knights began to question why they should hold themselves to standards that even the greatest among them could not maintain. If Lancelot, with all his proclaimed virtue, could not resist forbidden love, what did that say about the realistic expectations the Round Table could place on ordinary knights? The corrosive effect of this reasoning spread through the fellowship, undermining the moral clarity that had given the Round Table its distinctive character. A third group, perhaps the most conflicted, consisted of knights who believed the affair was occurring but felt paralyzed by competing loyalties. They honored Arthur and believed he deserved to know the truth about his wife's betrayal, but they also valued Lancelot as a brother in arms and feared that exposing him would destroy not just one man but the entire fellowship. They recognized that bringing the affair into the open would force Arthur to take action that could only end in tragedy, requiring him to either punish his wife and his greatest knight or appear weak and complicit in his own cuckolding. Neither option offered any good outcome, and these knights found themselves hoping desperately that somehow the crisis would resolve itself without requiring them to choose sides in a conflict where they had loyalty to both parties. Sir Gawain, despite his close friendship with Lancelot, found himself increasingly troubled by the situation. His code of honor was less refined than some others, but also more straightforward and less susceptible to rationalization. A knight served his lord with absolute loyalty, and actions that betrayed that lord were unforgivable regardless of the personal feelings that motivated them. Gawain had defended Lancelot vigorously when the first rumors circulated, but as evidence accumulated beyond what could be easily dismissed, he faced the painful recognition that his friend was engaged in precisely the kind of betrayal that the Round Table had been created to prevent. The realization did not make Gawain love Lancelot less, but it introduced a profound discomfort into their relationship, a sense that something rotten now existed at the core of the fellowship he had dedicated his life to serving. Mordred watched all of this unfold with keen interest and carefully concealed satisfaction. Arthur's nephew had arrived at Camelot under circumstances that were themselves controversial, his parentage the result of a union that some whispered had been incestuous, his claim to belong to the royal family both undeniable and deeply uncomfortable. Mordred possessed the intelligence to recognize that Camelot's power rested not on military might alone, but on moral authority, on the perception that Arthur and his court represented ideals worth following. The affair between Lancelot and Guinevere undermined that moral authority in fundamental ways, and Mordred understood that this weakness could be exploited by someone patient and clever enough to wait for the right moment. For now, Mordred simply observed and collected information, noting who knew what and who suspected what, mapping the network of loyalties and resentments that crisscrossed the Round Table Fellowship. He cultivated relationships with knights who felt slighted or overlooked, offering sympathetic ears to complaints about how merit was supposedly rewarded, but favoritism actually ruled. He never directly accused Lancelot or Guinevere, never put himself in the position of being the primary source of allegations, but he ensured through subtle interventions that rumors continued to circulate, and that evidence of the affair remained visible to those who cared to look. Mordred was building toward something, waiting for circumstances that would allow him to strike effectively against the kingdom he resented and the uncle whose position he coveted. The tension became almost unbearable during court gatherings where Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot were all present, forced to interact according to their official roles, while the unacknowledged reality churned beneath the surface. Arthur would laugh at something Lancelot said, genuine affection evident in every word, while across the hall, Guinevere maintained her queenly composure, despite wanting to weep at the harm they were doing to this good man. Lancelot would kneel to receive honours from the king, Arthur's hand on his shoulder conveying absolute trust, while Lancelot felt the weight of betrayal crushing him more surely than any enemy's blade. Guinevere would sit beside her husband, performing the role of devoted queen, while exchanging glances with Lancelot that conveyed everything they could not speak aloud. Those knights who suspected the affair watched these interactions with a kind of horrified fascination, unable to look away from the tableau of noble surface and rotten core. The perfect kingdom was revealing itself to be built on lies and betrayal, not in its relationship with the realm at large, but at its very center, in the triangle connecting king, queen, and greatest knight. The discovery was forcing everyone to reconsider what they had believed about Camelot, about the Round Table, about whether human nature was actually capable of the elevation Arthur's vision demanded, or whether the whole enterprise had been a beautiful delusion waiting to collapse under the weight of inevitable human weakness. Merlin perceived all of this with the bitter clarity of someone whose visions of the future were proving dismally accurate. He had seen shadows gathering around Camelot's brightness, had known that the perfect kingdom contained the seeds of its own destruction, but the specific mechanism of that destruction still grieved him despite his foreknowledge. The affair was not happening because Arthur had been a bad king or because Lancelot and Guinevere were fundamentally wicked people. It was happening because humans were humans, subject to desires and needs that transcended rational control, capable of genuine virtue, but incapable of sustaining perfect adherence to ideals in every moment of their lives. The tragedy was not that Camelot would fall, but that it would fall not despite, but because of the depth of feeling its central figures had for one another. The old wizard could have intervened more forcefully, could have brought the affair into the open through revelation of what his powers allowed him to perceive. But he understood that making the private crisis public would only accelerate the catastrophe rather than preventing it. Better to allow things to develop according to their own rhythm, to give Lancelot and Guinevere space, to perhaps find wisdom that would let them end the affair before it destroyed everything. That such wisdom was unlikely to emerge did not mean denying them the opportunity to discover it. Merlin had lived long enough to know that sometimes the kind intervention was to allow people to make their own mistakes and face their own consequences, to resist the temptation to manage every situation according to superior knowledge. As months turned into years, the affair became one of those open secrets that everyone knew, but no one officially acknowledged. The system limped along, functional enough to maintain appearances, but corroded beneath the surface by accumulated lies and suppressed knowledge. Camelot remained outwardly magnificent, its knights still the finest in Christendom, its king still the symbol of what just governance might achieve. But those who looked closely could see the cracks spreading through the foundations, could sense that the structure was becoming increasingly unstable, that eventually some incident would occur that would bring everything crashing down. The question was not whether the crisis would come, but when, and whether anything would survive when the perfect kingdom finally confronted the imperfection at its heart. Mordred had come to Camelot bearing a claim that no one wanted to examine too closely, but that could not be easily dismissed. He was Arthur's son, conceived during the chaotic years when the young king had first established his rule, and before he fully understood who his half-sister Morgause was when he spent a night with her. The circumstances remained murky, with some versions suggesting enchantment or deliberate deception by Morgause, others implying that Arthur had known exactly what he was doing and had simply succumbed to desires that acknowledged no boundaries of law or propriety. What remained undeniable was that Mordred existed, that his claim to royal blood was legitimate by the brutal facts of biology, if not by the niceties of law, and that his very presence at Camelot represented a profound embarrassment to the king who had built his realm on principles of virtue and legitimacy. Arthur had tried to handle the situation with the same mixture of justice and mercy he applied to other difficult circumstances. He acknowledged Mordred as his son while making clear that the young man had no claim to succession, that the throne would pass through more legitimate channels when the time came. He offered Mordred a place at court and even a seat at the Round Table, recognizing that the young man had abilities worthy of such honor regardless of the unfortunate circumstances of his birth. This attempt to balance acknowledgement with limitation satisfied no one. Those who believed strongly in the principles of legitimate succession saw Mordred as a living reminder of Arthur's fallibility, proof that even the perfect king had violated the most fundamental taboos. Those who might have supported Mordred's claim to royal privilege saw Arthur's refusal to name him heir as unjust treatment of a son who bore no responsibility for the circumstances of his conception. Mordred himself harboured resentments that grew more bitter with each passing year. At Camelot, he watched knights of demonstrably inferior ability receive praise and advancement, while his own considerable achievements were always qualified by whispered reminders of his tainted origins. He sat at the Round Table, but knew that many of his brother knights wished he was not there, that his presence reminded them of things they preferred not to think about regarding their beloved king. He called Arthur father, but understood that this relationship would never be publicly celebrated, would always carry shame rather than pride. The unfairness of his situation consumed Mordred's thoughts during long nights when sleep would not come. He had not chosen to be conceived, had not asked for the burden of carrying both royal blood and the stain of incest, yet he suffered the consequences, while Arthur continued to bask in the adoration of a kingdom that conveniently overlooked the king's own transgression. The comparison between how Camelot treated Arthur's violation versus how it treated lesser offences struck Mordred as particularly hypocritical. Knights who committed adultery with the wives of other knights faced severe punishment, sometimes execution, always exile and loss of honour. Lords who took advantage of women under their authority were condemned as betrayers of the very principles that justified their power. Yet Arthur's coupling with Morgause, whether through enchantment or simple weakness, was quietly ignored, its product tolerated but never fully accepted. This double standard revealed to Mordred what he believed was the fundamental truth about Camelot's vaunted idealism. The rules applied fully to the powerless and only partially to those strong enough to write exceptions for themselves. The perfect kingdom was built not on actual justice, but on the selective application of principles that maintained existing power structures while creating the appearance of moral superiority. These resentments might have remained merely personal grievances if Mordred had been a different sort of man. A simpler personality might have expressed bitterness through direct confrontation or obvious plotting, making himself easy to identify and counter. But Mordred had inherited intelligence from both his parents, along with their capacity for subtle manipulation. He understood instinctively that direct challenges to Arthur's authority would fail, that the king's position was too strong and too supported by genuine accomplishment to be overthrown through straightforward opposition. What was required was patience and the willingness to work through others, to identify existing fractures in Camelot's structure and widen them, to encourage the kingdom's internal contradictions to develop until they became fatal. The affair between Lancelot and Guinevere represented exactly the kind of opportunity Mordred had been waiting for. Here was a scandal that struck at the very heart of Arthur's authority, that made the king appear either weak or foolish, depending on whether one believed he knew about the betrayal. Here was hypocrisy of the most blatant kind, the greatest knight of the Round Table, violating the most fundamental principles of the code he supposedly embodied. Here was a situation that would divide the fellowship along lines of loyalty and principle, forcing knights to choose between supporting their king and protecting their brother in arms. Most importantly, here was a crisis that Mordred had not created and therefore could not be blamed for, even as he worked quietly to ensure it developed in ways that served his purposes. Mordred's approach was subtle and indirect. He never openly accused Lancelot or Guinevere of wrongdoing, never positioned himself as the source of rumors about the affair. Instead, he cultivated relationships with knights who already harbored suspicions, offering them sympathetic audiences when they expressed concerns about what they had observed. He would ask innocent-seeming questions during conversations at court, inquiries that reminded listeners of suspicious circumstances without directly making accusations. He ensured that knights who were loyal to Arthur and appalled by the affair were aware of other knights who were protecting Lancelot, creating the conditions for conflict to emerge naturally from competing loyalties. Everything Mordred did could be explained as reasonable behavior by someone concerned about the kingdom's welfare, but the cumulative effect was to ensure that the scandal could not be quietly managed or gradually resolved. Sir Agravain became Mordred's most useful instrument, though the knight never fully understood how he was being manipulated. Agravain was Gawain's brother, but possessed none of Gawain's generosity of spirit or capacity for forgiveness. Where Gawain had defended Lancelot despite growing evidence of the affair, Agravain saw in Lancelot's transgression an opportunity to bring down a rival who had long overshadowed other knights through his superior abilities. Agravain's motives were not purely about justice or protecting Arthur's honor. They were tangled with envy and resentment, with years of feeling inadequate when measured against Lancelot's standard. Mordred recognized these less noble motivations and fed them with careful conversation, always framing things in terms of duty and honor, while knowing that baser emotions drove Agravain's increasing determination to expose the affair. Through Agravain and others like him, Mordred began to construct a faction at court that demanded action regarding Lancelot and Guinevere. These knights positioned themselves as defenders of Arthur's honor and the Round Table's integrity, arguing that allowing such blatant violation of the code to continue unpunished made mockery of everything Camelot claimed to represent. They began to pressure Arthur more directly, moving beyond whispered concerns to open demands that the king investigate the rumors that everyone pretended not to believe, but that everyone knew contained truth. The effect was to force Arthur toward a confrontation he had desperately hoped to avoid, to make it impossible for him to continue pretending that the situation did not exist. Arthur found himself caught in an impossible position, every potential course of action leading to outcomes he could not accept. If he investigated the affair seriously, he would either confirm what he most feared to learn, or conduct an inquiry so obviously designed to avoid truth that his authority would be undermined by the transparent evasion. If he punished Guinevere according to law, he would lose the wife he had shared his throne with for years, would be forced to acknowledge publicly that his household had been the site of sustained betrayal. If he moved against Lancelot, he would destroy his greatest knight and his closest friend, would lose the man who had been instrumental in establishing Camelot's reputation throughout Christendom. If he did nothing, he would appear either weak or complicit, a king who could not maintain order in his own court, and therefore had no moral authority to impose it on his kingdom. Merlin counseled Arthur to act with great care, warning that the crisis was being deliberately provoked by forces that wished Camelot harm. But even the wizard's advice could not resolve the fundamental dilemma. The affair was real, not a fabrication of Arthur's enemies. Lancelot and Guinevere had actually betrayed him in the most profound way possible. The law that Arthur had established and that the Round Table was meant to uphold was clear about the punishment adultery merited, particularly adultery involving the Queen. To ignore that law would be to admit that Camelot's vaunted justice was selective, applied rigorously to the powerless while the powerful received exemption. Yet applying the law meant destroying people Arthur loved and depended upon, tearing apart the fellowship that was the source of the kingdom's strength. The crisis came to a head through careful planning by Mordred and aggressive action by Agravain. They arranged circumstances that would make the affair undeniable, that would force Arthur to confront what he had been trying desperately not to see. A tournament was scheduled that would draw Arthur away from Camelot overnight, creating an opportunity for Lancelot and Guinevere to meet with less than usual caution. Agravain and a group of like-minded knights positioned themselves to observe and then interrupt the lovers, ensuring that there would be multiple witnesses to what could no longer be dismissed as malicious rumor. The trap was elegant in its simplicity, using the lovers' own desire for connection against them, creating a situation where denial would be impossible and where Arthur would have to act. The night chosen for the trap arrived with appropriate theatrical atmosphere, storms rolling across Camelot, as if nature itself recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Arthur had departed for the tournament as planned, his absence the signal that had allowed Guinevere to indicate availability for meeting. Lancelot came to the Queen's chambers with the caution that had served them well for years, but not with sufficient vigilance to detect the knights who waited for exactly this opportunity. He entered through a private entrance that only the most intimate associates knew existed, finding Guinevere waiting in a chamber where they had spent countless stolen hours together. For a brief time, they existed again in their private world, finding in each other the comfort and connection that made the risk and guilt bearable. Then Agravain and his companions burst into the chamber, weapons drawn and faces lit with the righteous fury of those who have caught wrongdoers in the act. The scene that followed would be recounted in many versions over the years that followed, with details varying depending on whose sympathies the teller held. What remained consistent across all accounts was that Lancelot fought with desperate ferocity, killing Agravain and several other knights as he forced his way out of the trap. He begged Guinevere to flee with him, offering to take her away from Camelot to lands where they might live quietly beyond Arthur's reach. But Guinevere understood that running would confirm every accusation and leave Arthur with no alternative but to condemn them both utterly. She insisted that Lancelot escape alone while she remained to face whatever judgment came, hoping that perhaps some possibility of mercy or resolution might still exist. Lancelot fled into the storm, his departure marked by the bodies of knights who had been his brothers in arms only hours before. He carried wounds, both physical and spiritual, that would never fully heal, knowing that he had killed men who were not truly his enemies, but rather men who were defending what they believed was right. The fact that he had been forced to fight for his life did not erase the reality that he had murdered knights of the Round Table, that he had violated the Fellowship's most fundamental bonds in the process of protecting himself from consequences he genuinely deserved. Everything Lancelot had built over his years at Camelot, every achievement that had made him the model of knighthood, was destroyed in one night of violence driven by years of secret transgression. Guinevere was taken into custody by the surviving knights, held prisoner in her own castle while messengers rode to bring Arthur back from the tournament. She awaited his return with emotions beyond simple categorization. She felt guilt for having betrayed a husband who had given her no cause for complaint. She felt love for Lancelot and anguish at what their relationship had cost him. She felt fear of the punishment that law prescribed for queens who committed adultery, fear that was not simple cowardice but recognition that her death would hurt Arthur in ways that even her betrayal had not. Most painfully, she felt a kind of relief that the years of deception had finally ended, that the exhausting maintenance of double lives could cease, that truth, however terrible, was finally in the open. Arthur returned to Camelot to find his worst nightmare confirmed beyond any possibility of denial. The knights who had witnessed the lovers together told their stories with obvious reluctance, taking no pleasure in delivering news that they knew would devastate their king. The bodies of Agravain and the others killed in Lancelot's escape lay in Camelot's chapel, physical evidence of how far the situation had deteriorated. Guinevere waited under guard, her silence more eloquent than any defense could have been. The perfect kingdom was finally confronting the imperfection it had harbored at its core, and no one who witnessed Arthur's face when he learned the full extent of the betrayal could doubt that Camelot would never be the same. Mordred watched all of this unfold with carefully concealed satisfaction. He had not invented the affair or forced Lancelot and Guinevere into their transgression. He had simply ensured that private sin became public scandal, that the crisis Arthur might have managed quietly became an unavoidable confrontation. The seeds of betrayal that Mordred had patiently cultivated were now sprouting into the chaos he had planned for, and the harvest would be everything he had hoped. The perfect kingdom was tearing itself apart, not through external conquest, but through internal contradiction, proving what Mordred had always believed about the fraudulent nature of Camelot's idealism. And as the kingdom descended into crisis, opportunities would emerge for someone clever enough to exploit them, someone who had been waiting years for exactly this moment to arrive. Arthur faced the aftermath of revelation with a composure that those who knew him recognized as the stillness of profound shock rather than calm acceptance. He listened to the accounts of what had transpired in his absence, examined the evidence that could not be disputed, and understood that the life he had built over decades was irretrievably shattered. The betrayal cut deeper than simple adultery, though that alone would have been agonizing enough. Lancelot had been more than his greatest knight. He had been the friend Arthur trusted absolutely, the brother he had chosen rather than inherited, the man he had believed embodied everything the Round Table was meant to represent. Guinevere had been his partner in the great work of building Camelot, the woman he had shared his hopes and fears with, someone he had believed understood and supported his vision, even if their marriage lacked passionate intensity. That these two people, both of whom he loved in different ways and both of whom he had believed loved him, had maintained a secret life of betrayal for years was almost incomprehensible. The revelation forced Arthur to re-examine every memory, every interaction, wondering what had been genuine and what had been performance. When Lancelot had knelt before him to receive honours, had the knight felt guilt or simply satisfaction at maintaining his deception? When Guinevere had sat beside him discussing the kingdom's affairs, had she been present with him or thinking about her lover? The questions multiplied endlessly, poisoning the past as thoroughly as the present, making it impossible to distinguish truth from lie in the accumulated years of relationship. Yet even in his devastation, Arthur remained fundamentally who he was, a king who had built his realm on law and who understood that personal feelings could not supersede the principles that gave Camelot meaning. The law regarding a queen's adultery was ancient and unambiguous. She had committed treason not merely against her husband but against the kingdom itself, violated the fundamental trust upon which the legitimacy of the crown rested. The penalty prescribed was death by burning, a harsh sentence that reflected how seriously the offence was regarded. Arthur had established his authority on the premise that justice would be blind to the identity of the transgressor, that even the most powerful would face consequences for violations that would destroy the powerless. To grant Guinevere exemption because he loved her and could not bear to lose her would be to admit that everything he had claimed about equal justice was merely rhetoric. The trial convened with all the formal ceremony that Camelot could summon, an attempt to dignify what was ultimately a tragedy beyond redemption. Guinevere stood accused before an assembly of nobles and knights, many of whom wished desperately that circumstances were different, but who could not deny what had been witnessed. She made no attempt to claim innocence, offered no elaborate explanations or justifications for what she had done. She acknowledged the affair simply and without drama, taking full responsibility for her actions while refusing to implicate or make excuses for Lancelot. Her dignity in the face of certain condemnation impressed even those who most strongly condemned her betrayal of the king. She was going to die for her transgression, and she was meeting that fate with the same composure she had brought to her years as queen. The verdict surprised no one: guilty, with the prescribed sentence of death by burning to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. Arthur pronounced the judgment in a voice that remained steady through force of will, his face revealing nothing of the anguish that was destroying him from within. He had done what the law demanded, what his role as king required, and in doing so he had condemned to horrific death the woman he had shared his life with for years. The fact that the condemnation was just according to the kingdom's legal framework provided no comfort whatsoever. Justice and mercy were sometimes incompatible, and in this case, justice was demanding a price that Arthur found almost unbearable to exact. In the days between sentence and execution, Camelot existed in a state of terrible tension. Everyone knew that the situation was not concluded, that Lancelot remained at large somewhere beyond the kingdom's borders, and that he would not allow Guinevere to die without attempting rescue. The question was not whether he would come, but when, and whether Arthur would genuinely resist the rescue or secretly welcome it as a solution that spared him from having to implement the sentence himself. Guards were placed around the execution site, but their orders were deliberately ambiguous, instructing them to maintain security while leaving uncertain exactly how vigorously they were expected to fight against a rescue attempt by the kingdom's most formidable warrior. Lancelot came at dawn on the day of execution with a small force of knights who had remained loyal to him despite everything, men who valued their personal bonds more than their oaths to Arthur or their obligations to the law. They struck with precision and overwhelming force, scattering the guards and reaching the pyre where Guinevere stood bound, awaiting the flames that would end her life. Lancelot cut her free with his own hands, lifting her onto his horse and turning to fight his way back out through the gathering opposition. What followed was chaos of the sort that would be remembered and recounted for generations, a confused melee where brother fought brother and the bonds of the Round Table Fellowship disintegrated in violence. In the confusion of battle, tragedy compounded tragedy. Sir Gareth and Sir Gaheris, both brothers to Gawain, and both known for their gentle natures and reluctance to participate in violence, had been assigned to duty near the execution site. They stood unarmed as a gesture that indicated their disapproval of the entire proceeding, refusing to take up weapons even in self-defense. Lancelot, fighting in the desperate frenzy of a man who knew that failure meant the death of the woman he loved, struck them down without recognizing who they were, his blade ending their lives before he understood what he had done. The deaths of Agravain could be understood as the result of combat between armed opponents, but the killing of unarmed knights who had been Lancelot's friends and who had taken no action against him represented a crossing of lines that could never be uncrossed. Lancelot escaped with Guinevere and fled to his own lands across the narrow sea, taking with him those knights who chose loyalty to him over loyalty to Arthur. The rescue that might have been quietly welcomed as a solution to an impossible situation became instead the cause of new crisis, because Gawain's rage at the deaths of his brothers could not be contained or reasoned with. Gawain had been among Lancelot's strongest defenders throughout the affair, had argued that the rumors were exaggerated and that even if true, the matter could be handled with discretion and mercy. But the death of his brothers, particularly the manner of their deaths, transformed Gawain from defender to implacable enemy. He demanded that Arthur pursue Lancelot, insisted that the killing of unarmed knights could not go unpunished, threatened to lead a private war of vengeance if the king would not sanction official action. Arthur found himself trapped between personal desire and public obligation, yet again. Part of him was relieved that Guinevere had been rescued, that he would not have to live with having executed his wife. Part of him desperately wanted to simply let Lancelot and Guinevere go, to allow them to live out their lives in exile while he tried to rebuild what they had destroyed. But Gawain's fury could not be ignored or dismissed. The deaths of Gareth and Gaheris demanded response, and Gawain was not alone in believing that allowing Lancelot to escape without consequence would make mockery of the principles Arthur had built Camelot upon. If the greatest knight could betray his king, murder his brothers in arms and face no punishment, then what was the point of all the codes and oaths that supposedly governed the Round Table? The decision to pursue Lancelot across the sea was made more from exhaustion and inability to see alternatives than from genuine conviction that it was the right course. Arthur gathered what remained of his forces, leaving a minimal garrison to defend Britain while taking the bulk of his strength to lay siege to Lancelot's castle. The campaign that followed was heartbreaking in its futility. Neither side truly wanted to fight the other. The men facing each other across the battlefield had been brothers in arms, had fought together against common enemies, had sworn oaths of fellowship that went beyond simple military alliance. Now they prepared to kill each other because the people they had trusted to lead them had made mistakes that seemed to allow no other resolution. The siege dragged on for months, a desultory affair where both sides avoided decisive action, where opportunities to press advantages were passed over, where the combat seemed designed more to satisfy honor than to achieve actual victory. Arthur could have brought his full strength to bear and possibly breached Lancelot's defenses, but his heart was not in the enterprise and his tactical decisions reflected his ambivalence. Lancelot could have sallied forth with the elite warriors he commanded and possibly broken Arthur's siege, but he understood that victory against Arthur would mean destroying the kingdom he had helped build and possibly killing the king he still loved despite everything. They were locked in a conflict neither wanted but from which neither could honorably withdraw. The stalemate might have continued indefinitely if not for news from Britain that forced immediate decision. Mordred, left in charge of the kingdom during Arthur's absence, had used the opportunity to declare himself king, claiming that Arthur had abandoned his responsibilities and that the old king would never return from his futile pursuit of personal vendetta. Mordred had cultivated support among those knights who had remained behind, promising them advancement and reward, playing on resentments that had festered during Camelot's golden age. He had also spread rumours that Arthur had been killed or captured, that waiting for the king's return was foolish when the kingdom needed leadership in the present. The combination of ambition and persuasive manipulation had worked. A significant portion of the nobility had accepted Mordred's claim, and those who resisted found themselves suddenly labelled as traitors to the new order. Arthur received this news as a blow more devastating than even the revelation of Lancelot's betrayal had been. His son, the child of his own transgression, had seized the throne while Arthur wasted the kingdom's strength on a campaign driven more by Gawain's grief than by rational policy. Everything Arthur had built was being dismantled by someone who shared his blood, but none of his vision, someone whose resentments Arthur had never adequately addressed, because doing so would have required confronting the circumstances of Mordred's conception. The perfect kingdom was being usurped by the living reminder of the king's imperfection, and the cruel irony of this was not lost on Arthur, even as he prepared to return home to contest Mordred's claim. Before departing, Arthur sent envoys to Lancelot with a message that was both simple and profound. The old quarrel was set aside, not forgiven, but recognized as secondary to the larger crisis facing Britain. Lancelot was invited to return to Camelot to fight alongside Arthur one final time against a common enemy, to help preserve what they had both worked to build, even if their personal relationship could never be restored. The message carried weight beyond its practical content. It represented Arthur's acknowledgement that hatred and vengeance were luxuries he could no longer afford, that the kingdom's survival mattered more than his wounded pride or his legitimate anger at betrayal. Lancelot's response came not through words, but through action. He would come, bringing those knights loyal to him, arriving too late to prevent what was about to unfold, but in time to stand beside Arthur at the end. The decision was not easy. Guinevere argued against it, terrified that Lancelot would die in a battle that was not truly his concern, that he would throw away his life to help a king he had already betrayed beyond redemption. But Lancelot understood that some debts could never be repaid, and that attempting to repay them was still necessary. He had destroyed his honor through years of secret transgression. He could not restore what was lost, but he could at least die trying to protect what remained of the dream he had once embodied. The round table that had been the symbol of Camelot's unity was now shattered beyond repair. Some knights marched with Arthur back to Britain, driven by loyalty to their king and recognition that Mordred's usurpation was illegitimate. Others had already joined Mordred, swayed by his promises or convinced that the old order had proven itself too flawed to deserve preservation. Still others remained neutral, unable to choose sides in a conflict where both parties had claims to legitimacy and where both courses of action led to outcomes they found unacceptable. The fellowship that had once represented humanity's highest aspirations had fragmented along lines of personal loyalty and pragmatic calculation, its principles abandoned in favor of the very tribalism it had been created to transcend. Arthur sailed for Britain with a heavy heart, knowing he was returning to fight a war that should never have been necessary, that would pit him against his own son in combat that could only end in tragedy regardless of who prevailed. If Arthur won, he would kill his child and reclaim a kingdom that had been revealed as far more fragile than its years of glory had suggested. If Mordred won, everything Arthur had built would be dismantled by someone who had never shared or understood the vision that had made Camelot significant. There was no good outcome waiting, only the choice between varieties of disaster. The voyage across the narrow sea gave Arthur time to reflect on everything that had brought him to this point. The sword drawn from stone seemed a lifetime ago. The idealistic young king who had believed virtue and determination could transform human society, replaced by a weathered man who had learned the limits of what even the best intentions could achieve. The perfect kingdom had existed for a span of years, had actually functioned according to principles that elevated human conduct beyond the merely pragmatic. But it had not survived contact with the complexities of human nature, had been undone not by external conquest but by the passions and weaknesses of those at its center. Camelot would fall not because its ideals were wrong, but because sustaining those ideals required a consistency of virtue that humans ultimately could not maintain. The tragedy was not that people had tried and failed, but that the failure would be used as evidence that they should never have tried at all. Arthur's fleet approached the British coast under skies that seemed to reflect the darkness of the task ahead, clouds heavy with storms that threatened but did not yet break. The ships carried men who had spent years fighting together for a common cause, now returning to wage war against their own countrymen, against knights they had called brothers and lords they had served alongside. The contradiction weighed on everyone aboard, creating an atmosphere of grim determination mixed with profound sadness. They were sailing toward a conflict where victory would feel like defeat, and where the best possible outcome was the restoration of a kingdom that had already been irreparably damaged by everything that had led to this moment. Mordred had used the months of Arthur's absence well, transforming his initial opportunistic seizure of power into something approaching legitimate rule. He had distributed lands and titles to those who supported him, creating a network of obligations that bound ambitious men to his cause. He had made alliances with Saxon chieftains who saw in Britain's internal division the opportunity to finally overcome the resistance that Arthur's united kingdom had presented. Most cunningly, he had positioned himself not as a usurper overthrowing rightful authority, but as a reformer correcting the failures of the old regime. He spoke of Arthur's obsessive pursuit of personal vengeance against Lancelot, while the kingdom suffered, of the hypocrisy of a court that preached virtue while harboring adultery at its center, of the need for fresh leadership unburdened by the compromises and disappointments of the past. This narrative found audience among those who had been excluded from Camelot's golden age, or who had witnessed its corruption with growing disillusionment. Knights who had never earned seats at the Round Table saw in Mordred someone who might value them more highly than Arthur had. Lords whose territories had borne the cost of Arthur's idealistic policies without receiving commensurate benefits calculated that a new regime might redistribute power more favorably. Common people who had been told for years that Camelot represented justice and virtue felt betrayed by the revelation of scandal at the court's heart, and were willing to believe that change might bring improvement. Mordred was building his support not through raw force alone, but through appealing to genuine grievances and disappointed hopes. The first battle between Arthur's returning forces and Mordred's defenders occurred on the beaches where the king's ships made landfall. The fighting was vicious and confused, men struggling through surf and sand, while arrows rained down from the heights above. Knights who had trained together in Camelot's yards now sought each other's deaths, their skills turned against brothers in arms with tragic efficiency. Arthur fought with the fury of a man who had lost everything that mattered and had nothing left but the determination to prevent his kingdom from falling into the hands of someone who would corrupt its legacy. Mordred commanded from the heights, directing his forces with tactical acumen that revealed he had inherited at least some of his father's strategic gifts along with his ambition. The beach ran red with blood by the time Arthur's forces established their foothold, securing enough ground to bring the rest of the army ashore. The cost had been terrible, familiar faces missing from the ranks by day's end, knights who had survived dozens of campaigns against external enemies, cut down by fellow Britons in a civil war that served no one's interests except Mordred's. The victory was Pyrrhic, achieving tactical objective while demonstrating how devastating the larger conflict would be. Both sides had fought with the desperate intensity of men who believed they defended legitimate causes, and that intensity had transformed a military engagement into a slaughter that accomplished nothing beyond adding to the mounting toll of Camelot's dissolution. As Arthur's army moved inland toward the capital, Mordred fell back in calculated retreat, trading space for time while burning crops and poisoning wells to deny the invading force resources. The scorched earth strategy was militarily sound but emotionally devastating, forcing Arthur to march through the wreckage of the kingdom he had spent decades building. Villages that had prospered under his rule were now abandoned or destroyed, their populations fled or dead from the chaos that Mordred's usurpation had unleashed. Fields that should have been heavy with harvest were blackened wastelands. The infrastructure of roads and bridges that Arthur had constructed to facilitate trade and communication was being systematically destroyed to slow his advance. The series of battles that followed traced a bloody path across Britain, each engagement further depleting the strength of both armies. At a ford where a river ran swift and cold, knights drowned in armor when horses panicked and threw their riders into the current, the water carrying bodies downstream to tangle in the reeds. On a hillside overlooking a valley that had once been famous for its beauty, the fighting continued from dawn until darkness made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe, the slopes becoming so slick with blood that men could not maintain footing. In a forest where Arthur had once hunted with Lancelot during happier times, the two armies met in confusion among the trees, the battle fragmenting into dozens of separate, desperate struggles that continued long after any strategic purpose had been lost. Sir Gawain, whose rage at Lancelot had been instrumental in pushing Arthur toward the disastrous campaign across the sea, fell during one of these engagements. He had fought with reckless fury, his grief over his brother's deaths driving him to seek combat with a suicidal intensity that his comrades recognized but could not restrain. Mordred's champions knew Gawain's reputation and his peculiar gift of strength that waxed with the sun, so they avoided engaging him directly during the hours when he was most dangerous. Instead, they harried him with arrows and ambushes, wearing him down through the day until evening approached, and his supernatural vigor faded. Then they closed in for the kill, overwhelming him through numbers and the exhaustion of a man who had fought without rest or caution for too many hours. Arthur reached Gawain as the knight lay dying, cradling the head of the man who had been among his most loyal followers. Gawain's final words were not of glory or revenge, but of regret, acknowledging that his insistence on pursuing Lancelot had contributed to the disaster that was consuming the kingdom. He begged Arthur to seek reconciliation with Lancelot if possible, recognizing too late that maintaining the fellowship should have mattered more than avenging personal grievance. The irony that Gawain achieved wisdom only at the moment of death was not lost on Arthur, who watched another piece of his life bleed away onto Britain's soil. The nephew who had brought connection to the old magic and the older ways was gone, and with him went any remaining illusions that the crisis might be resolved through military victory. The losses accumulated on both sides with grinding inevitability. Sir Bedivere, Arthur's oldest companion and most trusted military advisor, took wounds that should have been fatal, but somehow survived through sheer determination and the skilled care of those who loved him. Sir Kay, who had managed Camelot's logistics and administration with quiet competence for decades, fell to an arrow loosed by an unknown archer dying anonymously in a conflict that made mockery of everything he had worked to build. Sir Bors, who had returned from the Grail quest with Galahad, and who had tried to maintain neutrality in the growing crisis, finally chose Arthur's side and died defending the king in a particularly vicious ambush. Each death diminished the kingdom, removing not just individual warriors but fragments of the collective memory and shared purpose that had made Camelot significant. Mordred's forces suffered comparable devastation. Knights who had joined his cause, believing they supported legitimate reform, found themselves fighting a civil war that was destroying the realm they had hoped to improve. The Saxon allies Mordred had recruited proved unreliable and opportunistic, more interested in raiding and pillaging than in supporting whatever political arrangements Mordred had promised. The common people whose grievances Mordred had exploited discovered that civil war brought suffering far worse than whatever injustices they had endured under Arthur's rule. Food became scarce as agriculture collapsed under the chaos. Disease spread through displaced populations and unsanitary conditions. The careful order that Arthur had imposed on Britain dissolved into the kind of anarchic violence that had characterized the years before his reign, all the progress of decades undone in months of fratricidal conflict. Merlin watched all of this unfold with the terrible foreknowledge of someone who had seen the pattern of events before they occurred, but had been powerless to prevent them. He had counseled caution and attempted reconciliation at every stage, but his advice had been overwhelmed by the momentum of human passions and the inevitability that flawed people would make flawed choices. The wizard had lived long enough to see cycles repeat, to recognize that what was happening to Camelot was not unique, but rather another instance of humanity's perpetual struggle between aspiration and limitation. The perfect kingdom was falling as perfect kingdoms always fell, undermined by the gap between the ideals it proclaimed and the nature of the beings attempting to embody those ideals. The enchanter's power was waning along with the kingdom he had worked decades to establish. The old magic that Merlin represented was fading from Britain as the new faith spread, and as the rational order Arthur had promoted replaced the mystery and wonder of earlier ages. Merlin found himself increasingly exhausted by the efforts required to maintain even simple enchantments, his sight into future and past becoming clouded and uncertain. He understood that his time was ending, that he belonged to a world that was passing away, and that the Britain that would emerge from the current catastrophe would have no place for wizards who remembered when the land was young and strange. Arthur finally cornered Mordred's main force near Camlann, a place whose name would become synonymous with tragedy and the end of heroic ages. The armies faced each other across a field that had witnessed battles in ages past, the ground soaked with centuries of British blood. Both forces were shadows of what they had been, depleted by the grinding campaign and by desertions as men on both sides concluded that continuing the fight served no purpose. Arthur could see Mordred's banner across the field and understood that this would be the decisive engagement, that one way or another the conflict would reach its conclusion here. There would be no tactical withdrawals or strategic repositioning after this battle. They would fight until one side or the other was destroyed, or until both armies had annihilated each other in mutual slaughter. In the night before the battle, Arthur attempted one final negotiation, sending envoys to Mordred with an offer of reconciliation. The terms were generous to the point of desperation, offering Mordred substantial territories and position if he would acknowledge Arthur's kingship and end the rebellion. Arthur was willing to accept almost any compromise that would stop the bleeding, that would preserve some fragment of what had been built, even if the perfect kingdom could never be restored. Mordred considered the offer with cynical calculation, recognizing that Arthur's willingness to negotiate from strength indicated weakness, that the king's support was more fragile than his military position suggested. The negotiations produced an agreement that satisfied neither side, but that both accepted as preferable to the alternative of final battle. Arthur would retain the kingship for his lifetime, after which Mordred would succeed to the throne. Territories and authority would be divided in ways that gave Mordred substantial power while maintaining the fiction of Arthur's supreme position. The arrangement was a compromise that insulted both parties while acknowledging the reality that neither could completely destroy the other without destroying the kingdom in the process. Representatives of both armies were to meet in the center of the field at Camlann to formalize the agreement, with strict instructions that weapons were to remain sheathed and that any act of aggression would violate the truce. The meeting occurred under skies that threatened but held back their storms, as if nature itself waited to see whether humans could step back from the abyss they had created. Arthur and Mordred faced each other with wary formality, surrounded by their chosen representatives, preparing to swear the oaths that would end the civil war. The tension was overwhelming, both sides poised for violence despite the nominal truce, hands resting on weapon hilts with barely restrained readiness. A single wrong move, a misinterpreted gesture, would be enough to shatter the fragile peace and plunge both armies into the final slaughter that everyone hoped to avoid. The wrong move came from an unexpected source, a knight bitten by an adder that had slithered across the field. The knight drew his sword reflexively to kill the serpent, raising the blade in a motion that those watching from distance interpreted as signal to attack. The armies surged forward in response, the careful truce dissolving in an instant as thousands of men who had been waiting for any excuse to continue the fight charged across the field. Arthur and Mordred found themselves swept up in the violence, their negotiated compromise obliterated by the momentum of forces neither could control. The Battle of Camlann began not through deliberate choice, but through accident and misunderstanding, a fitting symbol for how the entire tragedy had unfolded from its beginning. The Battle of Camlann unfolded with the inevitability of nightmare, each side fighting with the desperation of men who understood that no victory awaited but only varying degrees of annihilation. The field became a chaos of clashing metal and screaming horses, of orders shouted and ignored in the confusion, of individual struggles that meant everything to those engaged in them and nothing to the larger pattern of mutual destruction. Knights who had sworn oaths of brotherhood cut each other down without recognition in the press of combat. Banners that had flown side by side in countless campaigns against external enemies now marked opposing forces intent on each other's obliteration. The ground became treacherous with blood and bodies, making footing uncertain and turning every step into potential disaster. Arthur fought in the thick of the battle with a fury born of accumulated losses and the knowledge that everything he had built was dying around him. Excalibur, the sword that had been given to him by the Lady of the Lake and that had never failed him in righteous cause, now served to kill fellow Britons in a civil war that benefited no one. The king cut through Mordred's forces seeking his son, understanding that the battle would continue as long as both of them lived to command their respective armies. Around him fell knights whose names he knew, whose families he had dined with, whose achievements he had celebrated. Each death was personal, each loss a piece of his life being torn away. The perfect kingdom was ending not in glory but in this field of mutual slaughter, Britain's finest destroying each other while the kingdom they had all served bled to death. Mordred commanded his forces with cold efficiency, recognizing that he was fighting not for victory now, but for survival. The negotiated compromise had been his best hope for achieving power, and its collapse left him committed to a battle he knew he could not win. Arthur's forces, though depleted by the long campaign, retained advantages in numbers and in the quality of knights who had remained loyal to the old king. But Mordred had no path to retreat, no option except to fight until he prevailed or died. His ambition had brought him to this field, and that ambition demanded he see the matter through regardless of the cost. If he could not be king through negotiation, he would attempt to claim the crown through combat, and if he failed in that attempt, he would at least ensure that Arthur did not survive to enjoy whatever remained of the kingdom after this day's work was finished. As the day wore on, the casualties mounted to catastrophic levels. What had begun as two armies became fragments of units, then small bands fighting for survival, finally individual knights surrounded by enemies and facing death with whatever courage or desperation they could summon. The careful formations and tactical planning that had characterized earlier battles dissolved into pure chaos, where luck mattered as much as skill, and where the difference between life and death often came down to factors no one could control or predict. Men slipped in blood and died because they fell at the wrong moment. Knights survived impossible odds through random chance that spared them while killing comrades who seemed better positioned to endure. The battle became a demonstration of fortune's caprice rather than a contest of martial virtue. Sir Bedivere, grievously wounded but refusing to fall while his king still fought, stayed close to Arthur throughout the day's carnage. He had served Arthur longer than almost anyone, had been present when the young king first drew the sword from the stone, and had remained loyal through all the years and crises that followed. Now he fought with the grim knowledge that he was witnessing the end of everything he had spent his life building and protecting. His wounds bled freely, sapping his strength with each passing hour, but he would not leave Arthur's side while breath remained in his body. The bond between them transcended the formal relationship of king and knight, reaching into something deeper and more fundamental, a connection forged through shared experience and mutual trust that even catastrophe could not completely sever. The moment when Arthur and Mordred finally came face to face occurred late in the day when the battle had already been decided by attrition. Most of both armies lay dead or dying on the field, the survivors too exhausted to continue organized combat. Father and son confronted each other across a small space cleared by the bodies of those who had fallen, each seeing in the other both enemy and blood relation. Arthur looked at Mordred and saw his own youthful transgression given form, the living consequence of the night with Morgause that he had tried for years to simply ignore. Mordred looked at Arthur and saw the father who had acknowledged him only to limit him, who had given him position while denying him the legitimacy and acceptance he craved. They spoke briefly before the final confrontation, words that those who survived could not hear over the general chaos, but that carried weight, evident in both men's faces. Arthur may have offered one final chance for Mordred to surrender, to accept defeat and receive mercy rather than death. Mordred likely rejected such offers with contempt, understanding that mercy from Arthur would be worse than death, would mean living as the son who had failed to overthrow his father and who would spend whatever remained of his life as symbol of rebellion, punished, and ambition thwarted. Whatever passed between them ended with both men drawing weapons and moving to attack, the conclusion of their conflict approaching with tragic inevitability. The fight between Arthur and Mordred was brief and brutal, lacking any of the ceremony or honor that supposedly characterized knightly combat. They were too exhausted for elaborate technique, too injured to demonstrate the skills that had made both of them formidable warriors. They simply struck at each other with desperate force, seeking to end the matter before their failing strength made them vulnerable to finishing blows from the other's weapon. Arthur's experience and superior training showed even in extremity, his strikes more controlled and his defense more effective despite his wounds and exhaustion. But Mordred fought with the reckless fury of someone who had nothing left to lose, who understood that this moment would determine everything, and who was willing to accept any risk if it meant bringing down the father who had denied him his birthright. Arthur drove Excalibur through Mordred's body with a thrust that should have ended the fight immediately. The blade pierced armor and flesh, emerging from Mordred's back in a spray of blood that signaled a mortal wound beyond any possibility of healing. But Mordred, even as he died, pulled himself forward along the sword's length, using his impalement to close the distance to Arthur. With the last of his strength, Mordred struck with his own weapon, a blow aimed not at any protected area, but directly at Arthur's head. The strike connected with terrible force, shattering the king's helmet and crushing the skull beneath. Both men stood for a moment locked together, Arthur's sword through Mordred's body, and Mordred's weapon having delivered a wound that no mortal could survive. Then they fell together, father and son collapsing in a final embrace, that mockery of any reconciliation they might have achieved in life. Mordred died first, his eyes losing focus as blood poured from the massive wound Arthur had inflicted. Arthur lingered a few moments longer, consciousness fading, as the injury to his head spread devastation through his body. Sir Bedivere reached them as they lay together, pulling Mordred's body away and cradling Arthur with desperate care. The king lived still, but Bedivere could see that the wound was fatal, that Arthur's time was measured in minutes or hours at most. The perfect kingdom's king was dying on a field covered with the bodies of Britain's finest, the dream of Camelot ending in exactly the kind of violence and chaos it had been created to prevent. Around them, the battle continued in sporadic fashion as the last surviving combatants either fled or fought to their own deaths. The field at Camlann had become a landscape of pure tragedy, thousands dead for a conflict that had served no good purpose, that had destroyed rather than built, that had answered no important questions except to demonstrate that humans remained capable of destroying what they valued most when passion overwhelmed wisdom. A few of Mordred's supporters fought on, either unaware that their leader had fallen or too committed to their course to abandon it now. Most of Arthur's forces had fallen, the flower of British chivalry cut down in a single day of mutual annihilation. Lancelot arrived with his forces as the sun set on the field of Camlann, having ridden desperately to reach the battle in time to fight beside Arthur one final time. He came too late, finding not a battle he could influence, but a field of corpses and the remnants of armies that had destroyed each other. He rode among the dead, searching for familiar faces, finding them with heartbreaking frequency. Here lay a knight he had trained, there one he had fought beside in a dozen campaigns. The Round Table Fellowship was scattered across the ground at Camlann, the great experiment in noble governance reduced to meat for crows and memories for survivors. When Lancelot finally found Arthur, still barely alive in Bedivere's arms, he dismounted and approached with tears streaming down his face, confronting the ruin his betrayal had helped create. Arthur's eyes opened as Lancelot knelt beside him, some flicker of consciousness returning at the presence of the man who had been his closest friend before becoming his greatest source of pain. What passed between them in those final moments remained private, Bedivere withdrawing slightly to give them space for whatever needed to be said. Some accounts suggest Arthur offered forgiveness, releasing Lancelot from the guilt that was destroying him and acknowledging his own role in the tragedy. Others claim the king said nothing, that his silence conveyed more than words could express about the complexity of their relationship and the impossibility of simple absolution. What was certain was that when Arthur slipped back into unconsciousness, Lancelot remained beside him, unable to offer anything except his presence as partial atonement for everything he had done and failed to do. Arthur requested that he be taken from the field, that he not die among the carnage of Camlann, but rather somewhere that offered at least the illusion of peace. Bedivere and Lancelot lifted the king with infinite care, placing him on a horse and leading him away from the battlefield toward the coast, where the sound of waves might provide some comfort in his final hours. They rode through a landscape made strange by twilight and tragedy, the familiar fields of Britain transformed into something alien by the knowledge of what had been lost. Behind them, survivors picked among the dead, seeking comrades or valuables, the work of scavengers already beginning before the last victim had expired. The perfect kingdom was ending not with ceremony but with this quiet withdrawal of a dying king and two broken knights who had both loved and betrayed him. They reached the coast as full darkness fell, finding a beach where gentle waves washed smooth sand and where the air carried the salt taste of the sea. Arthur was barely conscious by this point, life fading from him in increments as his body succumbed to wounds that no care could heal. Bedivere and Lancelot laid him on the sand, making him as comfortable as possible while understanding that comfort meant little to someone in Arthur's condition. The king's breathing had become laboured and irregular, each breath a struggle that seemed likely to be his last. His eyes remained closed, his body still, except for the slight movements of respiration. He was leaving them, departing the world he had tried so hard to improve, and there was nothing they could do except remain present as he died. Then across the dark water, a boat appeared with no apparent source, moving toward shore despite the absence of oars or sail. It glided across the waves with supernatural smoothness, carrying figures robed in black whose faces could not be clearly seen in the darkness. The boat reached the shore and grounded gently on the sand, and the robed figures emerged to approach Arthur. Bedivere and Lancelot moved to defend their king, but Arthur's eyes opened one final time, and he gestured for them to stand down. He understood what was happening even if they did not, recognized that his time in the mortal world had ended, and that other powers were claiming him now. The robed figures were queens of Avalon, the mystical island that existed in the spaces between the world of men and the realm of eternal things, and they had come to take Arthur to a place where his wounds might be healed and where he might rest until Britain needed him once more. Bedivere and Lancelot lifted Arthur and placed him gently in the boat, watching as the mysterious craft pulled away from shore and disappeared into the darkness over the water. They stood on the beach long after the boat had vanished, unable to fully process what they had witnessed, uncertain whether Arthur had truly been taken to Avalon for healing, or whether they had simply watched their king die and been granted a vision that made his death more bearable. The question would never be answered with certainty, would remain one of the enduring mysteries of Camelot's fall. What was certain was that Arthur was gone from the world of men, and with his departure, the last fragment of what Camelot had represented vanished into legend. The survivors of Camlann scattered in the days that followed, knights who had fought on both sides recognizing that the battle had resolved nothing except to eliminate most of those who might have rebuilt what had been destroyed. Some attempted to return to their estates and resume the lives they had known before Camelot drew them into something larger than themselves. They found their lands ravaged by the civil war, their people scattered or dead, the careful order they had maintained eroded by months of chaos. Others became wanderers, unable to settle in a Britain that had been transformed by catastrophe, seeking purpose in a world where the meanings they had lived by had been revealed as fragile and conditional. Bedivere, grievously wounded and exhausted beyond endurance, made his way to a monastery where monks took him in and tended his injuries. He lived for some years after Camlann, spending his time in prayer and contemplation, attempting to make sense of what he had witnessed and participated in. He spoke little of Arthur or Camelot, finding that words failed to capture the complexity of what had been achieved and lost. When people asked him about the perfect kingdom, he would simply shake his head and turn away, unable to translate experience into narrative in ways that would satisfy curiosity without betraying truth. He died quietly one winter night, the last of Arthur's original companions passing from a world that had no place for what he represented, Lancelot returned to Guinevere one final time, finding her in the convent where she had retreated after the catastrophe at Camelot had made continuation of their relationship impossible. They met as different people than the lovers who had stolen moments in tower rooms and garden shadows, aged by suffering and loss beyond what years alone could account for. The passion that had driven them to betrayal had burned away, leaving only sadness and recognition of what their love had cost. Guinevere had taken vows that prevented any resumption of their affair, and Lancelot no longer desired such resumption. They spoke of Arthur and of guilt, of whether forgiveness was possible for what they had done, of how they might live with memories that offered no comfort. Then Lancelot departed, leaving Guinevere to her prayers and her penance. The greatest knight in Christendom spent his final years in hermitage, withdrawing from the world he had helped destroy. He lived simply and alone, his legendary prowess no longer relevant in a Britain that had moved beyond the ideals his abilities had once served. When death finally came for him, it found a man who had been waiting with something approaching relief, ready to be released from the burden of having been both the best example of what the Round Table represented and the instrument of its destruction. The contradiction had defined his later years, making his life a penance he endured rather than a gift he celebrated. His end was quiet and unmarked, the great Lancelot dying in obscurity as the world forgot what his name had once meant. The Britain that emerged from the catastrophe at Camlann bore little resemblance to the kingdom Arthur had built. The careful structures of governance and justice that had taken decades to establish collapsed within months, unable to survive the loss of the men who had maintained them and the king whose vision had inspired them. Local lords who had submitted to Arthur's authority during the height of Camelot's power now reclaimed their independence, carving out territories that they defended through force and maintained through the same brutal pragmatism that had characterized the pre-Arthurian era. The Saxon advance resumed with renewed vigor, pressing deeper into British lands as resistance crumbled without coordination or unified leadership. The roads fell into disrepair, the markets closed or became dangerous gathering places for bandits. The legal systems that had offered commoners hope of justice were replaced by the arbitrary rule of whoever held local power. The physical Camelot itself, the castle on its hill that had been the bright center of Arthur's kingdom, stood empty and increasingly desolate. The nobles who had populated its halls had died at Camlann or scattered to their own lands. The servants who had maintained its daily operations fled or found employment elsewhere. The great Round Table remained in the hall where Arthur had placed it, a piece of furniture too large and heavy to move easily, too invested with symbolic meaning for anyone to dare destroy it. But the seats around it stood vacant, dust accumulating on wood that had been polished to gleaming by those who understood what the table represented. Travellers who passed near Camelot in the years following Arthur's departure reported seeing the castle from distance, but finding it difficult to approach, as if some enchantment discouraged those who attempted to reach it. The perfect kingdom's capital was becoming a ghost, sliding from present reality into the realm of memory and myth. Guinevere lived on in her convent for several years after Arthur's death, spending her days in prayer and contemplation of the role she had played in Camelot's destruction. The women who shared her religious life treated her with respect tinged with uncertainty, aware of who she had been but unsure how to relate to a former queen who had fallen from grace through scandal. Guinevere welcomed the anonymity that monastic life provided, the opportunity to be simply another woman seeking divine mercy rather than a symbol of betrayal and the failure of idealism. She spoke little of the past, deflecting questions about Arthur or Lancelot with gentle firmness that discouraged further inquiry. The passion that had driven her to betray her husband had burned away entirely, leaving only a hollow ache where love had been, and profound regret over consequences she had not fully anticipated when she first allowed herself to love the man who was not her husband. In her final illness, Guinevere dictated a letter to be delivered to Lancelot, though she had no certainty that he still lived or could be found. The message was brief and carried the simplicity of someone who had moved beyond elaborate justification or explanation. She told him that she had loved him genuinely, that their affair had not been mere lust or frivolous betrayal, but rather a connection that had felt as real and true as anything in her life. But she also acknowledged what that love had cost, how their private joy had contributed to public catastrophe, how the greatest knight and the queen of the perfect kingdom had proven themselves capable of destroying what they claimed to value most. She offered no request for forgiveness and made no claims about whether what they had done was justified by the depth of their feeling. She simply stated facts and expressed hope that he had found some measure of peace before his own end came. Then she died quietly one autumn morning, attended by sisters who prayed for her soul while understanding only fragments of the complicated story that had brought her to their convent. Merlin had disappeared before Camelot's final fall, his absence noted by those few who remembered the wizard's role in Arthur's rise. Some stories suggested he had been entrapped by enchantments, worked by a woman he had foolishly taught his secrets, imprisoned in a cave or tree or crystal tower to sleep through the ages until Britain might need him again. Others claimed he had simply withdrawn from the world when he understood that his time was ending, that the age of magic was giving way to an era of faith and reason where his kind of power would have no place. A few insisted he still lived somewhere in the wild places, watching over Britain from hidden refuges and waiting for the moment when Arthur would return to reclaim his kingdom. What was certain was that the wizard's active involvement in human affairs had ceased, and with his withdrawal went the last direct connection to the deeper magic that had characterized Britain's earlier ages. The stories about Arthur and Camelot began to change almost immediately after the events they described, shaped by the needs and desires of those who told them. Knights who had survived the Civil War and who had fought on the losing side quietly adjusted their accounts, emphasizing loyalty to Arthur and minimizing their support for Mordred. The affair between Lancelot and Guinevere was sometimes omitted entirely from retellings, the narrators deciding that the tale worked better as pure tragedy of external enemies rather than as the more complicated story of internal betrayal and human weakness. Mordred evolved in various accounts from a complex figure with legitimate grievances into a simple villain, his motivations reduced to uncomplicated ambition and his characterization flattened to make the moral framework clearer and more satisfying. Arthur himself was transformed through successive retellings from a capable but flawed king who had achieved remarkable things before being undone by circumstances beyond his control into something approaching divinity. The stories emphasized his pulling of the sword from the stone while downplaying the years of civil war that followed. They celebrated the Round Table's ideals while glossing over how difficult those ideals were to maintain in practice and how frequently even the best knights fell short of the standards they proclaimed. The quest for the Holy Grail was reframed as universal triumph rather than the divisive catastrophe it had actually been, with Galahad's achievement held up as validation of the Round Table's virtue, while the fact that most knights failed miserably was quietly minimized. Arthur became the once and future king, the perfect monarch who would return when Britain faced its darkest hour to restore order and justice to a fallen world. This transformation served important purposes for those who remembered Camelot and for those who inherited its stories. The historical reality had been complicated and unsatisfying, a noble experiment that achieved genuine successes before being destroyed by the inevitable limitations of human nature. But the legend that grew from that reality offered something more valuable than accurate history. It provided a vision of what human society might become if people committed themselves fully to ideals of justice, honor, and service. It suggested that the gap between what was and what ought to be could be bridged through sufficient dedication and virtue. It gave people facing their own corrupt and brutal political arrangements a standard against which to measure their circumstances and a goal toward which to aspire. The fact that the historical Camelot had fallen made the legend more rather than less powerful, because it transformed Arthur's kingdom into permanent possibility rather than historical accident. The promise of Arthur's return became particularly significant as Britain endured the centuries following Camelot's fall. Each new crisis prompted speculation that perhaps this was the moment when Arthur would emerge from Avalon, wounds finally healed and ready to reclaim his throne. Saxon conquest, Viking raids, Norman invasion, civil wars all inspired hope among some portion of the population that the once and future king would return to set things right. The fact that Arthur never actually appeared did not diminish the power of the promise. Instead, his continued absence was explained as indicating that Britain's need had not yet reached the threshold that would trigger his return, or that the time was not quite right, or that one more generation would have to pass before the prophecy could be fulfilled. The unfalsifiable nature of the prediction gave it immortality, allowing it to survive every disappointment and every failed expectation. The Round Table's code, even in its failure to prevent Camelot's destruction, became the foundation for developing concepts of chivalry and noble conduct throughout medieval Europe. Knights across Christendom were trained in ideals that derived directly or indirectly from stories about Arthur's fellowship, taught to protect the weak and honor women, and speak truth and place service above personal gain. That actual knights rarely lived up to these ideals did not invalidate them any more than Lancelot's failure to maintain his vows invalidated the vows themselves. The standards remained meaningful precisely because they were aspirational, because they called people toward better versions of themselves rather than simply describing how humans actually behaved. The code survived because it articulated something important about what separated noble conduct from base behavior, even when those who proclaimed it most loudly violated it most thoroughly. The physical artifacts of Camelot's existence gradually disappeared or transformed into relics whose authenticity remained forever disputed. Excalibur had been cast into the water by Bedivere following Arthur's instruction, the great sword returning to the Lady of the Lake who had originally provided it, removed from the world of men to prevent it from being claimed by unworthy hands. Or perhaps Bedivere had secretly kept the sword, unable to obey Arthur's command to destroy such a magnificent weapon, and it had passed through various hands over the centuries until its current location became unknowable. The Round Table might have rotted away in the abandoned castle at Camelot, or it might have been claimed by some noble who recognized its value and installed it in his own hall, or it might still exist somewhere as tourist attraction or museum piece whose provenance cannot be definitively established. The Holy Grail that had inspired such devoted questing remained eternally out of reach, appearing in occasional visions to the particularly holy, but never claimed or possessed in any permanent way. Countless churches and monasteries claimed to house the true Grail, displaying cups and chalices that they insisted were the authentic relic, but authentication remained impossible, and belief remained matters of faith rather than evidence. The Grail's elusiveness became part of its significance, reflecting how the highest spiritual realities remained beyond human ability to fully grasp or possess. The fact that Galahad had achieved the quest but had then immediately departed the mortal world suggested that the Grail's attainment was incompatible with continued earthly existence, that some goals could be reached only by those willing to transcend the limitations of physical life. Writers and poets found in Arthur's story inexhaustible material for exploration of themes that remained perpetually relevant. They examined the conflict between love and duty through the relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere, asking whether genuine feeling justified betrayal of other obligations. They considered the tension between idealism and pragmatism through Arthur's attempts to build a kingdom governed by law rather than force, exploring whether human nature permitted such government or whether the attempt was doomed from inception. They investigated questions of legitimacy and authority through Mordred's rebellion, wondering what made one claimant to power more valid than another, and whether birth or merit or popular support or military strength should determine who ruled. Each generation found in Camelot's legend the concerns of its own time, discovering that Arthur's story could accommodate whatever questions seemed most urgent to contemporary audiences. The geographical location of the historical Camelot, if it had ever existed as actual place rather than literary invention, became subject of endless speculation and occasional archaeological investigation. Various sites throughout Britain claimed connection to Arthur, pointing to ruins or earthworks or place names as evidence of association with the legendary king. Each location had its advocates and its detractors, its apparently compelling evidence and its equally compelling reasons for doubt. The inability to definitively identify where Arthur ruled, if he ruled at all, became another aspect of the legend's power, allowing Camelot to exist everywhere and nowhere, to be a real place that could be visited and a mystical realm accessible only through imagination. The monasteries that preserved literacy and learning through the darkest centuries following Rome's collapse ensured that stories about Arthur survived in written form, copied by monks who recognized value in tales that taught virtue even as they entertained. These manuscript versions varied considerably from each other, each scribe adding or omitting details according to personal preference or the needs of the particular audience being addressed. The variants accumulated over centuries, creating a tradition that was simultaneously unified around certain core elements and remarkably diverse in its specific details. Arthur always drew a sword from stone or lake and always ruled from Camelot and always faced betrayal that led to his fall, but the circumstances surrounding these constant elements shifted with each retelling. The common people who never read the written versions nevertheless knew Arthur's story through oral tradition that passed from generation to generation. Parents told children about the once and future king, offering the tales as entertainment certainly, but also as instruction about how to navigate a world that often seemed arbitrary and unjust. The stories taught that virtue mattered even when it did not lead to worldly success, that attempting noble things was valuable even when the attempt ended in failure, that human dignity consisted partly in aspiring toward ideals that exceeded current achievement. These lessons took root in cultures throughout Europe and eventually beyond, shaping assumptions about heroism and nobility that persisted long after the historical circumstances that produced the original legends had been forgotten. The 20th century saw renewed interest in Arthurian legend as people sought meaning in the aftermath of catastrophic wars that had shattered confidence in progress and human goodness. Writers reimagined Arthur for modern audiences, sometimes setting the stories in contemporary periods, sometimes using the medieval framework, but asking modern questions about power and morality and the possibility of noble politics. The perfect kingdom became once more relevant as metaphor, offering both warning about the fragility of elevated social achievement and hope that such achievement remained possible despite setbacks and tragedies. Camelot entered political rhetoric as shorthand for idealistic governance, invoked by those who believed that human society could transcend the brutal pragmatism that often characterized international and domestic affairs. In the end, what survived of Camelot was not the physical kingdom or the historical facts, but rather the idea itself, the suggestion that humans were capable of creating societies that elevated rather than degraded, that called forth nobility rather than simply managing base impulses. The idea was made more powerful rather than less by having been attempted and failed, because the failure demonstrated that the challenges were real rather than theoretical, while the attempt proved that addressing those challenges was possible even if sustained success remained elusive. Arthur's kingdom endured not as place or period, but as permanent possibility, as a vision that each generation could pursue in its own way, according to its own circumstances. The legend promised that Arthur would return when Britain's need was greatest, riding from Avalon with the great knights of the Round Table restored to life and ready to fight once more for justice and virtue. The promise was never fulfilled in literal terms, no king emerging from mystical island to reclaim his throne and restore his perfect kingdom. But in metaphorical terms, Arthur returned constantly whenever people chose to act according to principles that placed service above selfish interest. Whenever someone decided that how they achieved their goals mattered as much as whether they achieved them, whenever a society attempted to organize itself according to law and justice, rather than simply accepting that power made right. Each such moment was an echo of what Camelot had represented, a small resurrection of the dream that had died at Camlann, but had never been entirely extinguished. The perfect kingdom existed for a brief span of years in a particular place, flourished according to the vision of a particular king, and fell through the accumulated weight of human imperfection. But the perfect kingdom also existed forever in the realm of human aspiration, a star to navigate by even when reaching it proved impossible, a reminder of what might be achieved when people committed themselves to something larger than their immediate interests. Camelot fell, but the idea of Camelot survived, and in that survival lay hope that the great experiment might be attempted again, in different form and different context, with perhaps slightly better results than Arthur achieved. The once and future king waited in Avalon for his return, and that wait would continue as long as humans believed that nobility of purpose and elevation of conduct remained possible, as long as someone somewhere held fast to the dream of a perfect kingdom where justice flowed like water and where the strong protected, rather than oppressed, the weak.